Macbeth, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 10, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Chapter 1. The witch was back. Just as she had the night of summer solstice, Sansaray arrived on the moor draped in a long black robe. The waxing moon hung near the horizon, watching for the lass's return, like a child lying low, hoping for a glimpse of Santa Claus. She strode with purpose toward the memorial cairn, empty-handed this time, but as she passed the first of the clan markers, the ring of green light burst into view, as if her shoes had scuffed the hard path and the spark from it had caught. Like a hula hoop from the 1970s, a foot thick and a foot high, it rotated around her without touching, wobbling slightly in its orbit. Though Macbeth watched closely, he could see no trace of faces in the light as he'd seen that first night. He wondered if he might have imagined it. After all, odd things entered one's mind on festival evenings. When she reached the cairn, she walked a wide circle around the spot where she'd built her strange white pyre, not a sennight before, keeping her eyes on the centre. And when she'd finished her circuit, she raised both hands elegantly in the air, and the pyre resumed burning just as if she'd brought her odd pile of wood and built the thing again. A fine magician's trick it was, and Macbeth suspected their wee witch might have done it solely to excite him and his fellows, for he'd been quite impressed himself, and he was not easily moved. Speaking of his fellows, there was no need to summon the remainder of Culloden's 79 ghosts, who moved apart from the rest of the spirits wandering the battlefield. All but a few stragglers gathered to her willingly now, eager to see who she would choose next to send on their quest. Now that Robbie had gone, there would be none among them who could refuse the challenge and not be thought a coward. If Robbie MacDonald had been courageous enough to do the witch's bidding, Macbeth expected the rest of them to step forward smartly and take whatever lay in store for him. Macpherson, number 33, showed no surprise when Sonny bid him come forward. Though the night was silent, but for the snap and pop of her grand white fire settling in, Macbeth was unable to hear a word of what she said to the man. He moved closer, intent on eavesdropping, but the Highlander disappeared in the span between one beat of Macbeth's heart and the next. No one was surprised when the MacGregors stirred up a ruckus yet again, but the wee witch held her ground, and had them well in hand. A fine, clever lass she was, able to hold so many with her will alone. Macbeth only wished he'd known such a lass in his day. He took another step forward, looking for a clearer view of the excitement. Sonny's gaze snapped up to meet his. She misinterpreted his movement, but after a nod of her approval, how could he tell her he'd not meant to volunteer?
Macbeth, my friend, your timing is perfect.
He forced a smile and ignored the murmurs of surprise spreading behind him. He was known well among the 79 for his sullen disposition and reluctance to participate in futile activities, but his fellows were not nearly as surprised as he was himself. 9 spirits and 1 dog had already left the field and not returned, so the wee witch's machinations might not be so futile as he'd expected them to be. He simply hadn't expected to be next. He moved quietly forward and separated himself from the throng of 69 others who were more curious than cautious now. He gave the dear lassie a courtly bow, but couldn't stop his mouth as he straightened. The lad is well. Sonny smiled widely and spoke to the gallery at large.
Robbie is very fine indeed, as is the dog Dolphin. I will break the rules just this once and tell you what Rabbi himself would wish you to hear. That he was canny and courageous and was able to save.
She troubled her lip with her teeth for a few seconds, then continued.
He was able to save a man's life, and he reaps the finest of rewards.
Macbeth found himself grinning and ceased. He was pleased for the lad, sure, but there was no sense making a fool of himself over it. "At your command, lass," he said. Sonny nodded, dug into her pocket and stepped close. With only the green ring between them, she held something out.
You'll need these, Jacques.
Zoc, his given name. He'd nearly forgotten it thousands of times. It was a gift to hear it again. He lifted an open hand over the green hoop, and a tendril snaked out like a serpent's tongue, while she dropped her gifts into his waiting hand. Unnerved, he snatched it back, and couldn't help retreating a step. But instead of the lads laughing at him, they muttered concern. Macbeth understood, of course. Soon it would be their turns to step close to the fire, and they too might have need to reach over the capricious green light. His fellows were watching, learning, assessing something that might well turn out to be an enemy, even though by all rights they shared the same goal as the green ring: protect the well-being and safety of one precious 16-year-old lassie. A lass who seemed to be the only person on God's green earth who could see and hear them, who truly cared for them. He opened his hand and found a credit card and a $5 bill in American currency. He tucked them into his sporran and buckled it. "And when I've accomplished my brave deed," he said quietly, "I'll have no need to face Charles Stuart. Exacting a pound of his flesh, or bleeding him, won't bring back the lives he threw away. I want peace, is all. I want away from the place, from the senselessness. I want to have done with all of it, and high time too." Sonny rolled her eyes and sighed.
Aye, Jacques Macbeth, I ken what you most desire, and you'll have it if you do what is asked of you.
She leaned a bit closer and whispered. He barely heard it himself, but he understood the jest.
All hail, Macbeth, that shalt be mortal hereafter.
Chapter 2. Zoc opened his mouth to argue with her for the 100th time over the difference in Shakespeare's play and the truth about his ancestor that was, historically, one of Scotland's finest monarchs. But the lass disappeared before his eyes, along with her bright fire and green hula hoop. Blackness surrounded him, as if he'd been placed in a deep, dark pit, but after only a breath or two, colours returned, bright and sharp, and bathed him in light all about. When his eyes were able to discern details again, he was standing in a queue inside a well-lit establishment. The two men before him were easily a head shorter than he, and stood before a long counter waiting for service. He turned to see what threats might come from behind, and found a woman ogling his kilt with wide eyes. It took a long moment to realize that no one had noticed how he'd arrived, though they were surprised by the way he was dressed. Thankfully, his kilt and sleeves were clean of the blood and mud of the moor. The lass behind him couldn't seem to drag her attention from his knees. Behind him, in line, waiting her turn. Embarrassed to be found in such a position, he stepped aside and bid her go before him. Reluctantly, she stepped forward, but her gaze darted back to his kilt every few seconds. The man who had been immediately in front of Zoc turned. After a long moment, he too realized his rudeness and asked the woman to go ahead of him. Zoc gave him an approving nod, and the man smiled and turned red, all the way to his bare pate before offering the tiniest nod in return. The man at the head of the line was sadly oblivious to the fact that a woman stood behind him, and even though Jacques cleared his throat twice, the man never turned, but eventually moved down to the end of the counter. The woman blushed and finally faced forward, since it was now her turn to order.
What would you like tonight?
The lass behind the counter smiled cheerfully, then her brow puckered when she found herself ignored. The other woman was clearly still distracted, so the younger lass repeated her question. The woman pointed her thumb over her shoulder at Jacques. The younger lass tilted her head so she could get a look at him. Then the pair of them laughed together. The woman then pointed at the board hung high on the wall and murmured something.
Spell your name, please.
The younger one requested, then penned the letters on a cup in her hand. He was in a coffee house. He should have known it from the fragrance hanging like an invisible but heavy cloud, blocking out most of the subtle tastes in the air. A dainty bell dinged behind him. Two women walked through the large glass door and stepped behind him before they too took a moment to appreciate his plaid. Again he stood aside and insisted they go before him. After all, he was in no hurry. No danger seemed imminent, unless someone was on the verge of burning themselves with the steaming stuff in their cups, and he could hardly be expected to anticipate which of the dozen or so patrons were about to do such a thing. He was pleased when the balding man, now at the head of the line, noticed the lasses and stepped aside for them as well, but his smile was more of a grimace then. Jacques gave him a hearty slap on the shoulder. "Take heart, mon." The lass behind the counter noticed what had transpired and laughed outright.
If you guys keep at it, you'll never get your coffee.
She finished her business with the two young women and waved the chivalrous fellow forward with a frantic wave.
Hurry before someone else comes in.
Then she laughed again. As before, she asked the man to spell his name, told him the cost, then instructed him where to insert his card. The fellow dug into his pants pocket, pulled out some $1 bills, then stuffed them into a large container marked tips, before moving to a small table to wait. Jacques stepped closer to her counter.
What would you like tonight?
He took one look at the door to make sure no women were entering, then faced her. He was pleased she'd taken the time to meet his gaze. However, his tongue seemed to lose its purpose for a moment, while he appreciated how her cheeks curved when she smiled. Hundreds of years ago, a smile like that might have seemed quite encouraging, had she not bestowed that very smile on every customer she'd served before him. The sobering thought helped his tongue to work again. "What would you suggest?" She was taken aback by the question.
I don't know. What do you usually drink?
Usually. A trick question, that. The last thing he'd used to cool his throat and quench his thirst, he'd scooped into his hand from little better than a trickling burn. Before that, my wineskin. "Tea, with milk, though I'd like to taste this American coffee you have." He'd added the bit about milk so she wouldn't think him poor if he had no milk for his tea, even though he didn't fancy it that way in the first place. She cocked her head and narrowed her eyes for a few seconds, straightened, and grinned again.
I'll take a stab at it, and if you don't like it, I'll make you something else.
He didn't care for the term she'd used. After all, he'd been finished off by a bayonet to the chest the last time he'd been living, and the word stab brought the moment and the sensation back to mind. He resisted the urge to rub at the side of his wound and gave the lass consideration for not knowing. In reply to her offer, he nodded.
That will be $5.25.
She tapped on the small black box.
Just slide your card in there, unless you have cash.
He unbuckled his sporran while he felt dozens of eyes upon him and pulled out the 2 items Sonny had gifted him with only moments before. The $5 was obviously not enough, which he couldn't take the time to comprehend, so he slid his card in the little slot as he'd been instructed. The machine beeped rudely at him.
Here.
She took his card, turned it around, and inserted it again. A more pleasant beep signalled a nod from the lass, and she returned the card. He took another step to the left and added the fiver to the tips.
Wait,
She poised her pen over a new cup.
spell your name for me, please.
Name? Can I forget it now? And the spelling, you dolt. S-E-O. The lass glanced sharply at him. C. He nodded to let her know he was finished. She lowered her chin and gave him a dubious look.
S-E-O-C?
Aye.
How do you pronounce that?
Zock, like shock, but more of a Z than an S. He demonstrated.
Like Jock?
She shook her head.
They'll slaughter it. How about your last name?
He frowned from side to side, wishing fewer people were within hearing. His last name always drew more notice than he wished, especially from a non-Scot. He leaned close and lowered his voice. Macbeth. Only after he'd said it aloud and noted the surprise on her features did he realise he could have used any of 100 other names and still known when his coffee was ready for him. He closed his eyes and waited for her pithy comment. The lass had been quick-witted thus far. Surely she would have something clever to say. Perhaps I am in coffee, stepped in so far.
Thank you.
She said, suddenly straight-faced.
If you want to take a seat, it will take just a minute or two.
After a quick glance at the empty doorway behind him, she took the cup to the small kitchen area and forgot him. Probably doesn't know her Shakespeare. After he'd made certain that no females would be left without a seat, he lowered himself onto a metal chair and tucked his sporran between his legs like a gentleman. The chair was cold, and what's more, he could feel it. He kept his face a smooth, emotionless mask, but inside he was jumping about like a wee child let outside to play. Of course, Sonny had told Culloden 79 she'd be giving them life again, so they might perform their daring do. She'd even teased him with a quote from the bard's play, telling him he would be mortal. But he'd supposed she would simply cast some spell that would give him substance for the duration of the quest, not life in truth. He was a learned man. Barring some miracle, like onto the Frankenstein tale, he couldn't fathom any way a body could be reanimated. But Sonny hadn't had bodies to work with. They'd been spirits only. Admittedly, he'd been educated in an area little more advanced than medieval times, but he'd studied what he could on the telly. He'd learned much more after death than he'd ever learned in life. But still, his respect for otherworldly things held strong for obvious reasons. He was a ghost himself, something that couldn't be explained by science, and he'd respected the fact that Sonny was a witch, and she was able to see them and talk to them, none of which could be explained by physics. So, truly, he shouldn't have been so surprised that Sonny was able to give him this gift, the gift of feeling the chill of metal beneath his, well. And yet, he was. A server called out 2 names, and the young women stepped forward, collected their beverages, and gave him a fleeting glance before stepping out into the dying light of the gloaming. Much earlier in the day than Scotland, then. 6 hours at least, for he'd left the Moor long after midnight. The small slip of paper the lass had given him read, "The Press Gang, Portland, Oregon." Oregon. The west coast of the States, then. Far, far from Culloden's boundaries. He gave himself a moment to consider whether or not he might miss his ghostly home. Although he'd been eager to quit the place, he'd anticipated regret for leaving it. It had become a part of him just as permanently as he'd become a part of it, so he'd expected something akin to homesickness to affect him, at least until he was settled elsewhere. But no. Perhaps Sonny's magic extended further than the ability to anticipate the cost of a cuppa.
Philip.
The bald man stood and collected his prize, then gave a nod to Jacques as he passed. His expression seemed quite cheerful compared to earlier, and Jacques wondered if the man was that delighted to have his hot drink in hand, or if he was pleased with himself for remembering his manners.
Mac,
said a quiet voice. The lass with the too charming smile stood at the end of the counter, holding a cup out to him. He reached for the drink and inclined his head to acknowledge what she'd done to avoid embarrassing him.
take your time, it's hot. And if you don't like it, let me know. I'll keep trying until I find something you'll love.
She gave him a bright wink and started to turn, but his fingers had overlapped hers, and she had to wait until he released her, else the hot coffee might have spilled. With a smile like that, and words like love tripping so easily off her tongue, he was tempted to hold her captive just a moment longer. It was a temptation he found himself unable to resist. She laughed. Eyes turned their way. He had no choice but to release her, and when she hurried back to serve a new customer, he knew she was relieved for the excuse. Poor lass, it must have been a frightening thing to have a stranger take such a liberty, and when he imagined other men doing the same, his stomach lurched. Surely the lass would be wise not to work in such a place where she would be forced to speak with strange and untrustworthy men all day. And due to the nature of her product, some of those men might not be pleasant while waiting for their addictions to be satisfied. He glanced about the tables to judge for himself what sort of man might visit the place on a regular basis. It only made him crosser when he found nothing objectionable in the current lot. His frown grew weighty, but he couldn't seem to help himself, so he bent his head to hide his features within the drape of his hair and returned to his small table. As any canny soldier would do, he turned his back to the wall and waited for the next round of customers to fill the seats. It shouldn't take much time to find the justification the lass would need to locate other employment, and perhaps if he pointed out that justification to her, her life might well be saved in the doing. If nothing better came along, it might be the good deed he'd been sent to do, for it would take no small portion of bravery on his part to give the lass such bold advice. And he'd take heed, ensure she wasn't holding a scalding cup of coffee in her hands when he broached the subject. Chapter 3. Kat was pretty proud of herself for keeping her cool. The trick was to look the guy in the eyes and keep her attention away from those knees. And how cute was he for letting all the female customers go ahead of him?
Cute? Are you crazy? You hate Scots, remember?
She took a deep breath and tried to concentrate on the customer in front of her.
Decaf. Of course, it's late.
She nodded and asked the guy to spell his name.
Jack. Easy. Thank goodness.
When she saw how shaky the letters were, she chucked the cup and started over. It had been enough time. She should check on the Scottish dude. He'd had plenty of time to taste his coffee and decide. She handed Jack's order off to Spencer and walked to the end of the counter.
Don't get close. Eyes off the knees.
She'd given her grandpa a hard time for the way he went on and on about Scotland. He'd told her if she ever went to Scotland, she'd probably fall in love a dozen times over and never come back to the States again. She doubted. She'd blamed it all on Hollywood. But at the moment, she wondered if the old man knew something about Scotsmen she didn't. Of course, her grandfather had never been to Scotland. He'd inherited a little Scottish blood from his grandmother, but that was it. There really was nothing to his obsession, and she'd pitied him for not having something better to give his loyalty to. In his attempts to pull off the whole Scottish package, he'd taken up smoking a pipe.
If he'd just found a football team to root for.
With long, dark hair and sharp blue eyes, her Scottish customer would be mouth-watering no matter what he was wearing. But he was downright heart-stopping in a kilt that looked more like ruffled bed-covers than the pleated things bagpipers wore. Lucky for her, she was able to keep her reactions hidden better than the other woman had. But she still had to speak to him again. Would she stutter? Would she drool? Would she trip and fall at his feet like every other woman in Portland was probably gearing up to do, and they didn't even know it yet? What she needed was a reason not to like him. A second later, she remembered she already had one. The obsession with Scotland was why her grandfather was on his last lung, and it helped wash away any magic love potion the guy might be carrying in his pouch.
Hey,
She said, hoping she wouldn't have to walk over to his table to get his attention, but that wasn't necessary. His gaze nailed her to the spot.
what do you think? Will it do?
She nodded at his cup. Aye, lass, whatever you've added to the coffee is perfection itself. The whole cafe fell silent at the trip of his tongue. He probably had a speech coach, was probably some weirdo from Spokane or something, had to move on to the next city where no one knew his story. But she didn't care about his story, or his brogue, or his plaid, or those knees,
Great.
and turned away.
It's kind of slow, Spence, and there's only a half hour before.
Go. Her manager gave her a wink. But if you want me to walk you, you'll have to wait. She was already halfway to the break room.
No need.
She clocked out on the computer, hung her still clean apron on a hook, then got her stuff and went back out front. 4 customers bumped around each other to get in the door. She turned to look at Spencer. Go. He pointed to the door and plastered a smile on his face for the new crowd. She didn't need to thank him. He knew how important it was for her to get home, and he'd only chew her out for dawdling. One day, when it was all over, she'd have to give in and go out with him. She owed him at least that much. She swung the door open and glanced to the side, out of curiosity, not interest. But the guy in the kilt was gone. Not that she cared. A cold raindrop splashed against the back of her hand. It was as good as a kiss. The skies above Portland loved her, knew how much she loved the rain, and seemed to give her a shot of cheer every time she needed it. The great Northwest, no better place in the world. The sun hadn't been down for long, so walking home alone didn't bother her. Surely the creeps wouldn't be out for hours yet. And if it rained any harder, they would be hiding in their holes all night. Besides, the streetlights reflected off wet cars and made her route home seem brighter than usual. A cheery place. No creeps allowed. She ignored the hood on the back of her vest and let herself get wet. It was more like a summer rain anyway, with no cool breeze to hide from. Just a casual shower of tiny droplets washing away tiny droplets of worry. Or maybe not so tiny. She took a deep breath of fresh air and wished the stirred-up dust could replace the smell of coffee in her nose. When she got home, she would open all the windows and smell the rain on the screens. The hairs on the back of her head tingled. She was being followed. She moved her bag over in front of her body to let her stalker know she wasn't going to give up her stuff without a fight. She also slowed just a little to prove she wasn't afraid. Nearly everything she'd ever been taught in self-defense classes rubbed her the wrong way. She wasn't about to let someone mess with her life. She'd worked too hard for everything, and she sure as hell didn't have time to go get a new driver's license and replace her credit cards. Give up her purse?
Not a chance.
And if someone wanted a piece of her, they weren't going to get the piece they wanted. She fished in her pockets and slipped her fingers into her brass knuckles. With her left hand, she plucked the taser out of her purse. A car passed and made that whispering, splashing noise that meant the road was wet but not yet soaked. Then another car. When they passed the alley where Kat was walking, the noise echoed into the darkness and died. Next to the buildings, the sound bounced and seemed louder. Then there were no cars at all. Nothing but the sound of footsteps behind her, at least 2 sets, and she could hear them whispering. Another alley was coming up. If she was going to be attacked, it would be there. She gripped the taser, lifted it clear of her pocket, but held it in front of her. Then she imagined turning and shocking the spit out of some couple out on a date. What if she was wrong? What if the hairs on the back of her neck stood up just because of the rain? Or because she had wondered about the guy dressed in a kilt who was out there in her city, somewhere. She was at the alley. 1, 2, 3. Now 6 steps. 7. Cleared it. Still no mugging. Another car passed. The wheels hissed against the wet asphalt. The sound died along the alley, then picked up again. Everything normal. The hairs on the back of her neck changed their mind and lay down again. Her ears strained for the sound of footsteps, but they were gone. People walked on the other side of the road, headed back toward the coffee shop. They paid no attention to her side of the street. Nothing interesting then, no gang of thugs preparing to jump her. Her phone rang once, twice. In order to answer it, she'd have to let go of the knuckles or the taser.
Not a chance.
It rang twice more, then stopped. Her pocket stopped glowing. The steps were back. The hairs all over her body came alive and apologized for not listening to her before.
Shoot someone.
They screamed. Her heart raced, but she wasn't going to let her adrenaline make her decisions. Whoever it was certainly hadn't got the message that she wasn't going to go down without a fight. So she took a deep breath and she spun around to face her pursuers. But there were no punks behind her, no couple out for a stroll in the rain, just a large Scotsman pausing in mid-step, startled to be caught in the act of stalking. Alone with him on the street, he seemed a good foot taller than he had in the coffee shop, a menacing psych patient following her home on the dark city streets. She pulled the trigger. Chapter 4. Some tasers are more powerful than others. Kat had purchased something with teeth to it. In the wintertime, it started getting dark at 5, but she'd been home before then. Now that she was also taking late shifts to cover the cost of the nurse visits, she knew she'd need protection. And a taser was just the ticket to keep her from worrying herself to death. However, just because Catherine Dabelko had a little backbone didn't mean she was capable of true cruelty. So she'd taken a class and learned how to use her weapon. She'd even allowed herself to be tasered so she wouldn't go around hitting every suspicious character she met. She knew how much it hurt, and she'd given herself a good 3 seconds to decide whether or not the tall, hot stranger deserved a taste of the concrete and a jolt that would shake the marrow off his bones. He'd crossed the line, and deep down, she believed that she hadn't made the decision based on the fact that she blamed the Scottish nation as a whole for her grandfather's lung cancer, at least not consciously. He didn't shake like any taser victim she'd ever watched before. It looked like he was doing a pretty good job fighting it, jerking only occasionally, instead of just convulsing as Spencer had done when he'd insisted she practice on him. Of course, her boss had been trying to earn a little pity, so she would start going out with him. He'd been so wrong. She was careful to release the trigger after just a few seconds. 50,000 volts could convey a pretty clear message in no time, despite how intelligent the receiver was. The guy rolled onto his back and slapped his arm against the sidewalk, making a noise that was somewhere between an angry growl and a sharp, short war cry. Then he lay still, gritted his teeth and blew out his breath like he was trying to blow up a balloon. His broad chest rose and fell like billows feeding a fire. Yeah, she knew what that burn felt like. Her fingers tingled in sympathy, remembering the sting of electricity hitting a dead end in her fingertips and just sizzling. She retraced her steps until she was standing 2 feet from his shoulder.
I'm sorry I had to do that.
His left arm shot out, and his hand caught painfully around her ankle and held her. She yipped, fearing some leftovers of electricity might enter her body through the connection, but she couldn't struggle without landing on her butt. She wasn't really afraid of him for some reason, but she still held on to the brass knuckles.
Let go of me, please.
She figured a guy with gentlemanly manners in a coffee shop would react to a polite request, unless he was out of his mind in pain. "One of us is a fool, lass." He released her ankle and rolled away from her. She suspected he meant her, but wasn't going to ask. She looked around the street, but no one seemed too concerned about the guy on the ground. It was dark and most faces had phones pressed against them. Kat turned to find they weren't as alone as she'd thought. A very curious woman came closer. Kat was disgusted when she realized the chick wasn't as concerned for the big man's safety as she was for how high up his kilt was going to ride. So Kat moved around to stand between the two, blocking the rude woman's view. It didn't seem to discourage her until Kat finally put her hands on her hips and gave an exasperated grunt. Only then did the woman show the least bit of embarrassment and walk away. When Kat turned back to see how he was recovering, the Scot was gone. Like, gone. Not ducking into the alley, not turning the corner in the distance. She hadn't had her back to him for more than a few seconds. He couldn't have gone far. The hairs on the back of her head were screaming at her again. She turned in circle after circle, but saw no one. So she decided the best way to get that screaming to stop was to grab up the leads of her taser and run for home. It didn't matter what it looked like. She was done trying to prove to the creeps on the street that she was willing to fight.
You can't fight what you can't see.
Zoc was pleased when he heard the slap of the lass's running feet. He ducked across the street and behind a parked car while the young woman had been distracted, and now that she was gone, he was able to breathe freely and recover. And to think, he was savouring his reclaimed sensations only a short while ago. Ugh, but he wasn't proud of calling her a fool, but he'd had no control over his tongue at that moment, nor control over much else. But he'd been lucid enough to know that she'd decommissioned the one man on the street, determined to protect her. She clearly felt threatened by him, which proved her opinion of him when she'd pulled the trigger on her taser. She obviously thought him a thug, no better than the 3 men he'd dispatched a block away who'd been bent on harassing her. Perhaps he should have been less discreet when knocking their heads together, then she would have known his gallantry. She'd have felt no need to wield her weapon, let alone use it on her saviour. It had happened so quickly, and yet he remembered all of it, despite the electricity still humming through his body. A misstep, He'd forgotten for an unfortunate moment that he no longer, a ghost, could not simply follow someone about without them knowing. A few centuries of habit were to blame, and he'd been so surprised by her sudden turn, he'd had no time to form the words that might ease her mind. A full second of surprise on both their parts. Another second of consideration on hers. He'd been certain she would give him the time to explain, but then in that third second, he'd read something else in her eyes, a conscious decision to shoot him. An innocent man, or fairly innocent in any case. Of course, he was guilty of following on her heels, but nothing so egregious as to earn him the bite of her weapon. A she-devil, to be sure. A she-devil that hid behind a come-hither smile. And the devil was getting away. Zoc jumped to his feet and started after her, hoping the slap of her shoes on the wet pavement would lead the way. He also hoped the small act of discouraging the trio of ne'er-do-wells wouldn't count for his heroic deed, for he wished to enjoy his mortality a wee bit longer, at least long enough to replace that electrified memory with something more pleasant, and long enough to put a certain mean-spirited lass in her place. Zoc stood and made for the road, intending to cross and go after the wench, but he paused for just a moment to consider. Was there a chance wee Sanseret intended for him to remain at the coffee shop? Was he missing the opportunity to prove himself, or had he already done so when he'd frightened away the 3 young rabble-rousers who'd been following the lass? It was a light detail, to be sure. They'd given up the fight so quickly, he doubted they would have truly caused the lass harm. But who was he to judge? He'd seen a fair number of pocket-pickers and their ilk on the grounds of Culloden who had appeared harmless, and some who caught his attention simply because they looked like trouble, with unkempt hair and clothes and a bit thin on the bone, had turned out to be the non-belligerent chaps who'd wanted nothing more than to enjoy the peace Culloden had to offer. So no, he could not say the trio were harmless at all, but since the wee witch had not yet come to collect him, he supposed the deed that awaited him would be a greater challenge. However, with no weapons to hand, he doubted it would be a bloody battle he'd be facing. But where was this test to be played out? He glanced back toward the tea shop. It was still close enough he could almost taste the dark, robust coffee in the air. It would be a simple thing to return and wait for trouble to find him. And to soothe his pride, he could see if another coffee confection might help erase the memory of convulsing on the walkway while the mean lass looked on. His chest tightened at the memory. Pride, surely, beat on his breast from the inside, demanding to be let loose. Before he made the conscious decision, his feet carried him across the street and to the left, following after the lass. He could only hope that trouble could find him wherever he happened to go. Chapter 5. It was a full 2 blocks later when he finally caught sight of her again. Her pale, sleeveless jacket fairly glowed at the far end of the path, and he wondered if it was a trick of the light, or if locating her was what God, or a certain witch, intended. But even if he hadn't suspected the lass of being involved in his personal quest, he was heartened by the sight of her, and considering the grudge he now held against her, that was mysterious indeed. Some heaviness in his chest lightened, and not just his chest, but his entire body felt a bit lighter, as if he could fly to her side if necessary. A story came to mind, a scene from a Superman movie where the fellow discovered he had the power to fly and practiced at it until he mastered the skill. And when Zoc hurried along on the half-deserted street, he put a bit of spring in his step just to see what might happen. Unfortunately, however, it only served to make his gait clumsy, so he stopped. The amused giggle of a young witch echoed in his head. He growled, "Go away, sonny. If you've no more direction to offer, dinna be listening in on my very thoughts, aye." Though he strained to hear, there was no further giggling, and he chided himself for entertaining such foolish thoughts. Witch or no, how could the lass listen inside his head? Until a week ago, Sansa had simply been his young friend, the visitor to the battlefield who enjoyed some strange connection with Macbeth and his 78 fellow warriors, those who had risen from the dead after the battle and found themselves together and at the same time, apart from the other spirits who wandered there. Was it true, then, that they'd all lingered all these years for a common thirst for vengeance, wanting their chance to be heard, to berate bonny Prince Charlie for taking such little care with their lives? It made no sense. It certainly wasn't what had kept him tethered to the moor. His steps slowed while his thoughts wandered back to the battlefield. His lean, powerful body was tiring with the new exertion. If he'd still been a ghost, he would simply allow his mind to clear itself, and in the doing, he'd find his rest for a bit. Quiet and unthinking, he would lie on his back near the Well of Souls and let time get away from him. But he couldn't do that any more. He picked up his pace and was soon only half a block behind the lass, which is where he remained, disinclined to catch her attention again and wise enough not to come within reach of her wee but vicious weapon. No, he would never again be able to allow time to slip away. He was allotted precious little of it to perform his heroics. After that, only God knew what was in store for him. Well, God, and perhaps a young 16-year-old Scottish lass. Zoc knew the moment the lass touched foot upon home ground. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands came out of her pockets, and she began looking at the faces around her, waving and smiling, calling out a greeting here and there. He only hoped she wouldn't take the time to look behind her. After all, she was still clipping along at a goodly pace, intent on getting somewhere as quickly as possible. A husband, perhaps. The thought drew his attention away from his feet, and he nearly tripped over the unseen leash of a small dog. The animal yipped, and the owner turned just as Zoc was backing away. "Pardon," he said, and quickly moved around the beastie, before the man at the other end of the teller took issue. So many people in current times took special care of their animals, and yet treated each other with such disdain. He would never understand it. He'd spent nearly 300 years on the moors with Dauphin, Rabbie's beast, and he never would have thought to treat one of his fellows poorly in favour of the dog. But times were different now. Perhaps loneliness ran in direct proportions with the growth in population. Private space seemed to be much more important than the people one chose to share their space with. But there seemed to always be room for a dog or a pair of cats. The lass neared the end of the block, and her path veered toward a large apartment building on the far side of the street. Zoc's instincts told him to slow and wait. He ducked into a wide doorway for good measure and peeked around the edge. She strode purposefully for the door, then paused and looked behind her before turning her attention to a keypad. Careful to shield her motions from onlookers, she entered a code, pulled the wide glass door open, then disappeared inside. He imagined her making her way to the elevator, taking time to arrive at another floor, unlocking another door, then turning on a light. He watched closely for a new window to light up. There, top floor, front west corner. On the fire escape, a dark figure scrambled about, then pulled open the window and ducked inside. Zoc took off in an all-out Highland charge. He paid no mind to the people who stepped out of his way, or to the looks that followed him. He only knew he was needed. This was the reason why he'd been sent to Portland, dropped in a coffee shop and lured away by the mean lass wrapped in a cheerful package. He was meant to save her from the intruder who waited for her return. He considered the front door for only a moment, but he didn't know the code, and there didn't seem to be much traffic coming in and out of the place. Chances of catching the door open were slim, and he had no time to dally, so he headed for the fire escape. He was lucky to be as tall as he was, for the end of the ladder was within reach of his most energetic leap from the large rubbish bin. An inch shorter, he would have failed. His arms strained as he pulled his body up the ladder until his feet could find purchase. As each story became harder to climb, he thanked God the building was not taller. For when he stood before the lass again and accepted her apology and her eternal gratitude, he would prefer not to be winded. Chapter 6. Kat hurried through the door and dropped her stuff on the mirrored table. She didn't worry about waking her grandpa because he always stayed up for a while after the nurse left. He looked forward to hearing the rundown of her day, and since she was home early, she could give him that rundown, fix him a bite to eat, then get an extra half-hour of sleep. She was way too young to crave sleep the way she did. People her age were staying up all night earning degrees or trying to keep their new businesses alive. She looked forward to the day she could be that kind of workaholic, or a sleep-deprived mother, instead of a sleep-deprived workaholic keeping someone else's business alive. That day would come, she knew, but when it did, it would mean her grandpa was gone, and she was in no hurry for that. The cloud of rubbing alcohol and chemicals filled the living room and made her glad for the coffee smell still lingering on her clothes. She would have liked to burn a fragrant candle, but an open flame was forbidden around the oxygen tanks. Her only option was to cook a little celery and onion in the oven, or a sliced apple with a little cinnamon sprinkled on it. But tonight she didn't want to take the time. Since she'd be home in the morning, she would open all the windows and make the old man forget he was sick at all.
A whole 2 days off. Imagine the naps I could take.
She stepped up to the mobile privacy screens and cleared her throat.
Grandpa, I'm home.
She always waited for an invitation. He had so little privacy anymore, she made sure he at least had it whenever possible. He cleared his throat with real effort, then coughed a few times. "Sweet Catherine, you're early." She heard bedclothes rustling. Come in. Come in." The privacy screens weren't nearly as effective as hanging curtains would have been, but they were cheap to rent, and they did a good enough job creating a bedroom out of half the living room space, and he was able to keep to himself or to be sociable at the drop of a hat, depending on his mood. Fortunately for her, Alonso Dabelco had a knack for staying positive, even though his lung cancer hadn't responded to treatment and he was living on borrowed time. She plastered the brightest smile of the day on her face and stepped around the screen.
Hello, Grandpa.
She stepped forward to hug him, but he waved her back and started coughing. She plucked tissues out of the box on his hospital tray and held them out to him. He hated to be watched when he coughed, so she turned her back to him and pretended she didn't notice. In reality, she listened to every little wheeze and grimaced at the sound of such a rough throat. She pulled the blue curtains closed on the front windows. They were tall and wide, and allowed in a generous amount of sunlight in the morning, and if she stood close and looked to the east, she had a great shot of Mount Hood. In the late afternoon, the windows invited a wonderful cool breeze to slip through if she opened all three of them by a few inches. There was a trick to it,
That nurse forgot to open the windows again.
she said after the coughs grew further apart.
But I promised to do it in the morning, unless you need some fresh air now.
She looked over her shoulder, and he shook his head at her before starting up again. She straightened the pillows on the couch while she waited for him to settle down. A strange clanging sounded from outside. She held still and listened. Metal against the building. Someone was on the fire escape and wasn't being quiet about it. Out of habit, she rushed to the entry table and dug her phone out of her purse, ready to call the police if there was trouble. They'd lived there 4 months without anything more alarming than a bike being stolen from the hallway, but that kind of luck couldn't last in a big city, she was sure. Her grandpa gasped, then stilled. She hurried to the screen and shoved it out of the way, worried the man was choking. He was fine. His attention was on the side window, where some dark form moved on the landing of the fire escape. The window flew open, and a pair of large, bare, very manly legs stretched down to the floor. A drape of plaid cloth barely covered the guy's unmentionables, but she didn't dare turn her back. After all, this streaker was only a few feet away from her grandpa's bed. Her fingers found 911. The call connected, rang once. 911, please state your emergency. She was distracted by the fact that the plaid cloth looked familiar, and her heart dropped when she realized what was still left to come through the window. She started backing away. Your emergency?
A streaker. A stalker. A man just came in through my fire escape. I'm pretty sure he followed me home from work.
The stalker in question paused while straightening his kilt and lifted his head just enough to skewer her with a bright blue eye and a raised black brow. Chills rushed up and down her spine and exploded into each other like a liquid form of the Three Stooges. She nearly dropped the phone. We'll send a squad car right away. Did you say he's nude? Can you lock yourself in another room, or can you get out the door?
I can't leave. My grandpa is an invalid.
Oh! The invalid in question sat up in bed, clapping and waving the big Scot closer. Come in, laddie, come in. He turned and called to Kat. Sweet Catherine, did you arrange this? Ma'am, what's he doing now?
He's shaking hands with my grandpa.
Your intruder is shaking hands? Ma'am, are you sure this is an emergency? She shook herself to get a grip.
Yes. Please send the police. I have an intruder in my house. Apartment 404.
She gave the address. Aye, you have an intruder, the Scot said. I saw him crawl through yon window when you turned on your lights. He frowned at the old man for a second. Or perhaps it was another window. It was hard to tell, you ken, from across the street. He faced her again, his eyes narrowed like they had when she'd teased him. Only then he'd still been incapacitated and lying on the ground. Now he was there in her house, probably remembering every little volt.
I think you'd better hurry,
she said quietly into the phone. Why? What's he doing now?
Remembering that I shot him with my taser.
When? Just now?
No, about 15 minutes ago, on the street.
Officers are on their way. Stay with me if you can. For about 5 minutes, Kat and the dispatcher listened to each other breathe. The Scot started answering her grandpa's questions, but from where she stood, halfway into the kitchen, she couldn't hear the details, just the tone. Her grandpa was like a kid coming face to face with his idol, which really ticked her off, because the old man didn't know who he was talking to. Ma'am, officers will be there in a couple of minutes. Is your taser live?
No,
And where is the intruder?
just standing there.
And he was, glancing back and forth between her and her grandpa, while the old man rattled off questions faster than his hoarse voice could handle. Well, if you don't have a weapon to defend yourself, you might want to apologize.
Apologize?
I accept. The man grinned at her, winked, and sat down in the corner of the bed to give all his attention to her grandpa. Ma'am, the officers are at the door. Can you ring them in?
Yeah.
She sidled to the entrance and pushed the buzzer, then left the door ajar before stepping to the edge of the living room again. Both men ignored her and kept chatting like old school chums. She focused on her breathing while she waited for the cavalry. She realized she was holding her phone in front of her like a gun, but she couldn't seem to stop, even when she heard the ding of the elevator from the hallway. She was seriously frozen in place, watching the Scot's mouth move, watching her grandpa laugh and smile at words she couldn't make out. Scottish small talk, probably.
I hate Scots.
At least she tried really hard to hate them the whole time she stared at the poster boy for all things plaid. Ma'am. She turned toward the officer standing behind her right shoulder. He was trying not to smile. Ma'am, you can put your phone down now. He tapped her raised arm, and the touch seemed to unfreeze her.
Thanks.
She put on a brave smile.
I'm sorry to bother you guys, but this guy followed me home from work, climbed in through the window, and now he's like casting a spell on my grandpa or something.
A bigger cop stepped up behind the first. They exchanged glances, but kept straight faces. She had to give them credit. The second cop glanced around nervously. Someone got shot with a taser. The Scot raised his hand. And who shot you, sir? That raised hand folded and pointed at her. The cops stepped away from her a little, and the first one gave her phone a worried look. And where is that weapon now, ma'am? She pointed at her purse, lying open and unthreatening on the table.
It's yellow. Look.
She pointed at the Scot.
He's an intruder. I didn't hurt him. I shot him out on the street, not in here.
The smaller cop glanced at the window. On the street? She didn't know why that mattered.
Yes, he was stalking me, following me home. I was sure I was in danger.
Aye, the lass was in danger, officers. Adonis was frowning again. 3 lads followed her out of the tea shop, coffee house, and had nefarious plans for her, I've no doubt. She grunted.
You were the only one following me.
Aye, I followed to see you safely home is all. I frightened the 3 away, but it worried there might be others. The bigger cop held up a hand to interrupt her. These 3 lads, was one of them blonde, curly hair? Aye, with a large slash of red paint on his jack. Jack? The Scot nodded. A light coat, if you will. The first cop smiled and nodded. He means jacket. The Scot rewarded Sherlock Holmes with a smile. The man was still blushing when he faced her. 3 guys flagged us down half an hour ago to tell us that some creature roughed them up in an alley. We were pretty sure they were high. Maybe they weren't. All 4 men laughed in stereo. What was this? The Twilight testosterone zone? She put her hands on her hips.
So, are you going to arrest him?
The first cop acted like she was the one that wasn't making sense. He said he was protecting you, and the 3 thugs have pretty much verified it. What more do you want? She gasped 3 times, waiting for someone else to come to their senses, but none of them did.
I want him out of my home, and maybe those thugs want to press charges.
Charges? I doubt it. Not if they'd been following you in the first place. But hang on. Little Sherlock looked at the Scot. "You want to press charges against her for shooting you?" Those bright blue eyes sparkled. His lips curled. She could tell the second he'd made his decision. Not only was she not going to get her extra half an hour of sleep, she wasn't going to be able to sleep in her own bed that night. She was actually going to be arrested. Then something in those eyes changed. "The lass has already apologized. As a gentleman, I must forgive her." He inclined his head like he'd just won a joust or something in her honour.
What a joke.
The bigger cop gave her a look that said she should be counting her blessings and kissing her intruder's hem. The truth smacked her in the face. If she stomped her feet and insisted on pressing charges against her stalker, he could change his mind and press charges against her. And he could probably produce that witness too, the chick who had tried to look up his kilt while he was lying on the ground. Kat was pretty sure the woman would be able to remember every detail. Chapter 7. In an act of pure treason, Alonso de Belco turned on his granddaughter. He claimed the Scot was a friend of his whom he'd invited into his house, an upstairs neighbour who had agreed to give his granddaughter a bit of a thrill. He knew how much she liked men in kilts. Since she wouldn't call her grandpa a liar in front of the rest, she'd simply excused herself and went to her room, locked the door and got in the shower. If the cops weren't going to arrest the guy, she wasn't going to waste any more of her sleeping time. She had a routine. If she didn't keep to it, she wouldn't be able to sleep, and no one was going to keep her from her daily dose of shut-eye. And if Grandpa wanted to fraternize with the enemy, he was on his own, at least for a little while. He wanted to go ahead and trust a stranger who'd followed her home from work. He could just fend for himself for a while. Maybe he'd realize the guy was nuts before the cops got around to leaving. While she washed the smells of coffee and vanilla from her face, she prayed that the little party in her living room was breaking up. Her chest tightened, but she took some deep cleansing breaths to wash away the anger. The cops couldn't be blamed, of course, for not being more alarmed. They'd probably expected to find a standoff, not a perp having a friendly visit with a sick old man. And of course, they couldn't really take her side of things when they'd learned that she had in fact attacked the perp. The tightening returned in a heartbeat. Of course they could have taken her side. They should have taken her side. She's a young, single woman in the city, and they were supposed to be protecting her. It was her home that had been invaded. It didn't matter how charismatic that invader was. She hurried through her routine, dried off, and slipped on a t-shirt and sweats, hoping to catch those cops before they were gone. She would give them a piece of her mind, and the Scot too, if she moved quickly enough. She wasn't the type to hold grudges. She wasn't even the type to tell someone off, but she was pretty sure she wouldn't be able to sleep a wink when she felt so mistreated. Catherine de Belco might be a kind, positive person, but she was no doormat. In her hurry, she grabbed for the bedroom door, and the leg of a chair caught her baby toe and nearly ripped it off her foot. She gasped in a deep breath, and it came out in the form of a long string of every curse word she'd ever heard in her life, and a couple originals. Unfortunately, she'd been opening the door when she'd said them. While the pain in her toe subsided to a howling throb, she stared into the faces of 4 startled men. The cops looked at her with a combination of disgust and disappointment. Her grandfather was downright embarrassed, but the Scot looked pleased as punch. She'd just given the other men another reason to side with the guy. If he and she were at war, this would be the point where her own troops would turn coats and sneak to the other side. led by her own grandfather. She glared at the smaller cop.
I nearly ripped my toe off, okay?
He looked doubtful, so she reached back, grabbed the chair and slid it into the living room. It caught the edge of the rug and toppled over. His hand moved to his holster. She rolled her eyes.
I wasn't throwing it at you.
The guy was still unimpressed. He exchanged a look with his partner that said whatever she got now, she deserved. Then he headed for the door. The big one said goodnight to the Scot and her grandpa, then followed. He stopped with his hand on the door and addressed her. We're gonna let you and your grandpa work this out. Since he lives here too, you should let him have some say in who gets to visit. He's a sick man. Try to remember that. When the door closed, her mouth was still hanging open, and though she'd never in her life thrown anything in a fit of temper, she was tempted to throw the stupid chair at the door. The way her luck was going, however, there was a good chance they'd come back and arrest her for being rude to her grandpa's guest. She turned and glared at that guest, and was not surprised to find him still smiling.
You may have them fooled, but the three of us know the truth.
She spared a glance at her grandpa, and he had the decency to look guilty. To the Scot, she simply said,
Get out.
No, Catherine, her grandpa said in a rare, stern tone. I won't allow you to be rude to the man. He clearly came to your rescue tonight, and we owe him some gratitude. He leaned back against the raised bed and panted like chastening her had taken all his strength, but he could have been acting like he often did if he wasn't getting his way. She just couldn't be sure. And, Zog, the old man lifted his hand half-heartedly, then dropped it to the bed again. My friend, trust me, Catherine has never acted like this before. I don't know what's gotten into her. Maybe she's just excited.
Grandpa!
He wasn't too exhausted to flinch at her tone, but quickly went back to playing the part of a dying man. The Scot bought it all, hook, line and sinker, and hurried to her grandpa's side. He touched the old man's forehead. Can you fetch me a cloth and a bowl of cool water, lass? He glanced up at her. Sweating, he said. Could be a number of reasons.
Sweating?
She went to the linen closet and got a washcloth, trying not to feel too defensive. The word fetch didn't sit well with her, but it was probably a Scottish thing. Bring, fetch, same thing. She got some water in a small ice cream bucket and took them both to the bed and nudged the Scot out of the way.
I can do this,
she said, trying not to sound like a witch. She wet the cloth, wrung it out, and patted her grandpa's forehead.
How are you feeling?
She still suspected he was acting. His lips moved a little, but then stopped. After a few deep breaths, he was asleep. She turned off the lamp next to the headboard and pressed the button that lowered the head of the bed. She couldn't lower it too much or he would start coughing, but she was able to make him a little more comfortable. A couple of weeks before, he'd been able to lie nearly flat. Soon, she wouldn't be able to lay him back at all. What would she do then? Make him sleep on his stomach? She smoothed the covers and touched his hand for a long minute. All part of the ritual. Ritual was all that kept her going these days. Suddenly self-conscious, she turned and found that the Scot had given her some privacy. He sat at the table in the kitchen, staring at his fingers like they were new to him. He looked up when she flipped on the light above his head. I am sorry, lass. For your fairly imminent loss. He nodded toward the living room. She sighed and shuffled over to the stove to turn on the kettle. It was going to take a little herbal tea to get to sleep this time. The stressful day ritual.
I'm going to have tea. Would you like some before you go?
The slight stress she'd added to the word go had sounded pretty rude, but she was too tired to care. Besides, the Scot brought out the worst in her, not her fault at all. I can go now if ye prefer it, lass. She shook her head.
That's all right. We'll call it apology tea.
He inclined his head.
And you can tell me what the hell you're really doing, following me home and climbing through my window.
He bit his lip for a second, then nodded. The rest of the ritual went on in silence. She opened up her tea box and let him choose what he wanted. Chamomile for her. Since he was obviously Scottish down to his boots, she figured he was probably used to having a snack with his tea, so she pulled out a tin of chocolate chip cookies she'd made 2 nights ago, when she hadn't been able to sleep. She took off the lid and set it on the table, and nodded for him to take one.
They've got walnuts. My grandpa likes anything that crunches.
He took a bite. Divine, truly. Oh, thank ye. Then the rest of the large cookie disappeared in 2 bites. She pushed the tin toward him and watched him down 2 more. It had been a long time since anyone had complimented her cooking, and she tried to hide her blush behind her cup. But then again, sitting so close and staring at his handsome face might have been the real reason she felt flushed. It was a little unnerving to be facing any stranger without a nice high counter between them, let alone Adonis. She finally forced herself to set her cup down.
Do you want to tell me what's going on?
He pushed the tin away from him and took up his tea. Not dangerous, that is for certain.
Except to thugs.
He nodded. Not dangerous to you nor Alonso. His use of her grandfather's first name didn't bother her as much as she thought it might. It was kind of nice having someone else think of him as a person and not a patient. Usually people called him Mr. Tabelco when speaking about him, even if he was still in the room.
Okay, so let's pretend I believe you. Why are you here?
He frowned and took so much time deciding what to say, she knew it wouldn't be the truth.
Don't worry about it. I don't need to know.
She took up her cup again and drank the rest in spite of the temperature.
He'll be waking up in a few hours, so I need to sleep while he sleeps.
The Scot got the hint and stood. He carried his cup to the sink before walking back to the living room. She pointed to the door and raised her eyebrows. He shook his head, and all that lovely hair with it. I'll just go the way I came, aye, instead of fumbling through the building trying to find my way out of it. He unlocked the window, then turned to look at her again. I've no doubt you've been a fine nurse to your grandfather, he whispered, but I believe you should prepare yourself. He's not much time left. She hurried around the bed and stood close to keep her grandpa from overhearing any more than he already might have.
He doesn't need to hear anything negative, do you understand? Especially from a stranger that doesn't know anything about him. You're not a doctor.
Aye, lass, I am. His hand rose up and cupped the side of her face. The lamplight from the far corner reflected in his eyes, and they were filled with such sincere regret it nearly shattered her.
Get out.
It was little more than a breath, but their faces were so close he had no trouble hearing her. He nodded, but didn't move, like there was something more he intended to say, but she didn't want to hear it. She tried to pull his hand away from her face, only when she laid her fingers on his wrist, they just kind of stuck there. It was so warm and firm and strong, she could almost imagine borrowing some strength from it. The silly thought passed, and after a slight tug from her, his hand fell away. He lifted the window and disappeared in one smooth, drawn-out movement. The tail end of his plaid was the last to disappear through the opening before the window lowered again. She moved closer to the bed and watched her grandfather sleep peacefully on, with the clear forks of a cannula stuck up his nose. He hadn't heard a word, thank goodness. His hand was still warm and soft. He was no worse than he had been the day before. No need to turn up his O's, his oxygen. Everything was fine. She ignored the warmth that lingered on her face in the shape of a man's hand.
A doctor? Please.
Doctors didn't run around in costumes and break into apartments to visit patients that weren't theirs. He was just crazy. She reached for the latch to lock it, but paused. Just one more glimpse of him wouldn't hurt anything, and she could rest easier knowing that he had really gone. So she lifted the sash and stuck her head out. The rain had stopped, but the smell of wet streets and damp bricks swirled around her head, along with the remnants of smoke. Poindexter from the apartment below had been smoking some on the fire escape again. Maybe that was who the Scot had seen and tried to rescue her from. Maybe he hadn't been making up that part either. Though she searched the shadows, there was no trace of him. She would have expected it to take him more time to reach the ground, but it wasn't the first time he'd disappeared on her. After she'd teased him, he'd gotten up off that sidewalk and disappeared awfully quickly. She turned her head and looked up toward the roof, but there was no movement on the small metal ladder that led from her own landing to the top of the building. Besides, you'd have to be a ghost to get up the rusty old thing and not make a noise. A ghost? She laughed to herself. Only moments ago, she'd had a firm grip on one of his wrists, and he definitely was not a ghost. Some self-appointed superhero was more likely, but either way he was gone, and good riddance. Her grandfather's health was holding its own, and as long as she kept the coffee flowing and the home health nurse paid, Alonzo de Belco wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 8. When he heard the window open, Jacques peeked over the top of the ladder and was pleased to see the lass was at least curious about him. It had taken a trick or two to get the lass's attention, and he'd begun to think his appeal might have been emitted from his new body, but perhaps she'd only been pretending her indifference. Her bonny head turned to look up the ladder, and he quickly backed away and held his breath while he waited to see if he'd been caught. A canny lass, to be sure. A stubborn lass as well. She clearly had no intention of letting her grandfather leave this world without fighting God or Lucifer for him. But in the end, in the very near end, she would lose that fight. While the lass had been in her room, he'd asked the old man some pointed questions, and after the policeman had realized he was a doctor, they stood back and gave them some privacy. It was clear the man's body was shutting down, something he didn't want to tell his granddaughter. And when she'd told Jacques to get out just a moment ago, he'd realized why the fellow had wanted to keep his secrets. The lass would likely try her hand at resuscitation on the spot. It had been Alonzo out on the landing, enjoying a precious private moment and a pull on his pipe, and in his current state it was a wonder he was able to make it back into bed before his granddaughter found him. She'd come home early, it seemed. Lucky for Jacques, the old man held Scotland near and dear, even though he'd never stepped foot there. So the sight of a Scotsman in full regalia had given him a shot of adrenaline to see him through the evening. He'd pressed Jacques for details he wasn't willing to share, but after he confessed to the old man that he did not have a place to lay his head for the night, Alonzo had pointed to a key hanging beside the window on a wee nail. An enclosed shelter awaited him on the roof, a potting shed of sorts where his granddaughter pottered around when she'd time. Jacques waited for the lass to close the window once more before he dared move about. It took a few moments for his eyes to adjust to the starlight, but he easily found his shelter. The lock turned, the door opened, and the smell of rich earth welcomed him into the darkness. A damp night, to be sure, but he left the doors wide and stretched out on the long chair. Rich earth, rain, and a wet chill in the air. He couldn't have felt more at home. He took a deep breath and bid welcome to a mortal night's rest, but the lass's face sprung to mind. So many expressions to choose from. The welcoming smile at the coffee shop, the split second when she'd decided to shoot him, the drop of her jaw when he sat on the bed, and when the officers would not share her concern. And as much as he'd wanted to make her admit that there was a meanness inside her, something that didn't smile at the world unconditionally, he now wanted something else more. He wanted to wipe away the terror he'd seen in her eyes when he'd warned that her grandfather was not long for this world. He'd seen that same terror 100 times when he was alive, and hundreds more at the Battle of Culloden, when the wounded realized they were going to be murdered where they lay. No matter what he did or how he begged, he was unable to save more than a few of his fellow Scots that day. But maybe if the minx downstairs would allow him to get close again, he could save her some of the heartache that now stalked her, like a redcoat wielding a bayonet. In spite of the fact that Grandpa's face had twisted when she'd mentioned food, Kat was cooking him the most tempting breakfast she could.
If this bacon doesn't make him hungry, nothing will.
"What's that?" he hollered.
I said that I wasn't going to call you a liar in front of the police, but next time you tell stories about a neighbor from upstairs, you need to remember that we're on the top floor.
Grandpa laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. "I was wondering when you'd catch that." She plated up a large mound of scrambled eggs, added buttered toast and a pile of bacon. A mug of coffee was already cooling, and she scooped that up too and headed for the other room, chuckling as she came round the corner.
I'm just glad you didn't offer him the key to my shed.
She stopped and stared at the empty nail beside the window.
You didn't.
"What?" Her grandpa looked at the nail and frowned. "I certainly did not. I don't know where you lost it this time." He pointed to the plate. "Is that all for me?" She watched him for signs of guilt, but didn't see anything obvious. The way he was eyeing his breakfast made her a little suspicious, of course, since he'd made such a face when she told him she'd be cooking it.
Yes, it's all for you.
He was a little too excited, and it broke her heart, knowing he was pretending just for her. But she wasn't above taking advantage of his overacting. Every bite he took made him stronger, so as long as he was eating, she didn't care why. Or at least she would pretend not to care, as long as he kept eating. But as soon as he stopped, she was headed to the roof. She glanced at the nail again, then at the window. No way the guy could have shimmied up that ladder without making a racket. Her grandpa tried to distract her by moaning over the breakfast. "This is just what I needed. I thought you were going to make me eat mush again." She'd made him eat mush the first week they'd been in the apartment. Trying to be clever with their money, she'd made a detailed meal plan that would save hundreds on their food bill. But cracked wheat mush had been a bad idea, and the oatmeal. He'd forced it down the first 4 days because she'd sold him on the idea of eating a traditional Scottish breakfast. But then he'd Googled traditional Scottish breakfast and called her on the carpet. The breakfast in the photos he'd found included sausage, egg, ham, mushrooms, tomatoes of all things, and baked beans. Photo after photo had been the same, only some of them had some black stuff they'd learned was either haggis or blood sausage, and she certainly wasn't about to cook him those. After the debate, she'd realised the cheapest option was to run down to the corner and get him a sausage McMuffin most mornings. Grandpa took a small bite of bacon and smiled. Then he turned green so fast she lunged for the empty ice cream bucket from the night before. He was able to keep down what he'd already eaten, but he insisted she take his plate away. She came back with a cup of tea. He shook his head and closed his eyes, so she set the tea on his tray and turned to open the window. "What are you doing?" He was wide awake again.
Going up to see if I left the key in the shed or in the lock.
What? What if my breakfast comes back up again? She almost felt bad. He sounded so weak, but she stayed tough.
You've got your bucket. I'll be right back.
The door buzzer interrupted. A climb up to the roof would have to wait, even though she wanted to get away from the thick, greasy smell of bacon that hung in the air like a cloud, waiting for gravity to bring it down. She went to the door and pushed the intercom.
Yes?
Hello?
May I help you?
Aye, lass, you can. This is Zoc Macbeth from last eve. I'd appreciate a chance to apologise if you will allow me to come up. She stepped to the end of the entry to exchange a look with her grandpa, whom she could see clearly with the portable screens moved out of the way. She half expected him to be jumping out of bed to come push the buzzer himself, but instead his eyes were closed again. He'd dozed off. She couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light coming through the big windows, but his colour was wrong. She hurried back to the intercom and pushed the speaker, while at the same time pushing the buzzer to release the door to the building.
Yes, please come. Apartment 404 and hurry.
Chapter 9. Kat already had the pulse oximeter on her grandpa's finger and was replacing the cannula with an oxygen mask when a very different-looking Scotsman rushed into the room. His hair was tied at the back of his neck, and he wore jeans and a baby blue t-shirt that was at least one size too small. It had a white logo on it, but she didn't dare stare long enough to read what it said.
He doesn't usually need much oxygen in the mornings,
She explained in a quiet voice.
but he looks a little gray to me, and he's usually not sleepy until about 10.
The Scot came around the bed, and she made room for him to get a close look. He picked up a pale, soft hand and looked closely at the nails. The oximeter beeped. She peeked around his arm to read it.
79.
She adjusted the oxygen gauge.
I should have tested him first thing.
The Scot frowned at her. Dinna look back, lass. Regrets are futile. She nodded.
Should we wake him up and make him take some deep breaths?
He shook his head. Maybe allow him to rest a wee while, aye. Let the machine do the work for a piece. She read the oximeter again.
92. It's recovering.
Only then did she start to shake with relief, or maybe from holding her breath too much. But either way, she was careful to hide her hands with her long sleeves. With the Scot's help, they placed the screens along the side of the bed, closed the curtains, and moved quietly into the kitchen. By that time, she was feeling normal again.
I'll have to admit, I'm glad you came when you did. I usually don't freak out like that,
You dunna get enough sleep, hmm? He stooped a little to make her look at him, then winked. They'd ended up standing face to face in the narrow gap between the table and the cupboards. She smiled, but had to look away fast. The baby blue of the t-shirt brought out the blue in his eyes, and she was determined not to get lost in them. They were like two bright little puddles that she was careful to walk around or she'd ruin her shoes, or her life. She'd always been careful to tell herself, and everyone else, that she would worry about making her own life later. She would date later, have a family later, choose a real career later. And no matter how long she held things off to take care of the grandpa, she knew she would never regret a day of keeping him close. Besides, it wasn't as if someone that looked like that would ever be interested in a simple barista with no time to waste at the gym, let alone shopping for trendy clothes. In a rather smooth move, she put some distance between them by turning her back and stepping to the stove.
Have you had breakfast?
When he didn't answer right away, she faced him again. He was fidgeting with his hands. With most of his hair tied back, she could see his face clearly. She couldn't imagine what he was embarrassed about. Finally, he spoke. I admit I was up and at 'em early this morning. I found a pastry shop and thought it would be a shame not to sample some of their confections while they were warm, and though I had intended to bring a box of them to share with ye and Alonso, I am ashamed to say they did not survive the journey. She laughed.
Don't tell me. Voodoo donuts?
Aye, he grinned. They say the magic is in the hole, but I believe they are wrong. They laughed together then, but quietly. She lifted an empty plate and shrugged.
If you ate the whole box, I don't suppose you like bacon and eggs then?
He craned his neck to look at the stove like a starving teenager. She rolled her eyes and told him to sit down at the table. Before I do that, I must make a confession, lass. Perhaps you'll wish to recant the invitation. She leaned back against the oven door and folded her arms. He'd sounded pretty nervous, which made her nervous too. But the only thing that might really upset her was if he started talking about Grandpa going downhill. If he did, she figured she could use the spatula to get him back out the door before he said too much. He dug 2 fingers into his jean pocket, pulled something out and set it on the table. It was the key to her potting shed on the roof. She would have recognized the little jute loop anywhere. I took advantage, he said, then stood at attention and waited.
I don't think you took the key on your own.
She glanced at the living room.
You couldn't have known what it unlocked unless someone told you.
His brow furrowed like he worried she wasn't taking him seriously. I accept all responsibility.
Oh, sit down, would you?
She turned her back to him again, dished up a plateful, and set it on the table in front of him.
Some protein to go along with your donuts.
He pulled out a chair and sat, apparently willing to forgive himself. She fixed another plate and 2 cups of coffee. He popped back to his feet when she joined him. Manners, there in her own kitchen.
So, are you homeless?
He took a napkin from the pile on the table and wiped his mouth. She tried really hard not to watch, but failed. Only for a pair of days, he finally said. Fresh from the boat, you might say.
From Scotland?
Aye, and I've no ken how long my plastic will last.
So you don't want to pay for an expensive hotel?
Just so. She relaxed a little. Pinching pennies she could understand, but a doctor pinching pennies? Then again, maybe they didn't pay British doctors like those in the US.
So what kind of doctor are you?
He took a long sip of coffee and wiped those chiseled lips again. Battlefield. Whoa. The guy was just one surprise after another.
Afghanistan?
He finished off his last bite of toast and wiped his mouth again. She would have stopped grilling him while he ate, but he was already done. He pushed his plate back, gathered his mug between his hands and leaned forward. The sleeves of his t-shirt would have groaned if they were capable of making noise. I served where my fellow soldiers fought. He watched her face closely, then shrugged. But I haven't doctored anyone for quite a while now. That explained why he might have to pinch pennies.
Well, I'm sorry you had to sleep on a lounge chair.
The chair and the fresh air were grand, lass. It was generous of your grandfather to offer it, aye, but it pained my conscience to do it behind your back, and I would ask your forgiveness.
Forgiven.
He insisted on helping clean up. For the next 20 minutes, they danced around each other while they washed pans and tried not to clang them together. Every once in a while, one of them would make a misstep and they'd bump into each other or clink the coffee cups, and they tried not to giggle. When it was all finished, and the dish towel hung on the back of a chair to dry, she was almost sad it was over. They faced each other in front of the sink. There was no reason for him to stay, no excuse to ask him to. But he wasn't exactly running for the door. "I'd like to thank you for the breakfast, lass."
You're welcome. And my name is Catherine.
He shook his head. "Nee, Catherine, I'd like to thank you properly." He took 2 tiny, slow steps closer, swaying as he came. His hand rose to the side of her face, just as it had the night before, and she realized he was going to kiss her.
He's a stranger. Don't let him do it.
The angel on her other shoulder urged her to wrap her arms round his neck and make it last until he ran for the door. She settled for something in between. He lowered his head toward her, glancing back and forth from her lips to her eyes, giving her plenty of time to protest, giving her plenty of time to burn the moment into her memory. Finally, when he touched his lips to hers, she was relieved. In the back of her mind, she was expecting him to come to his senses and turn away at the last second, but he didn't. Much to the disappointment of both angels on her shoulders, she didn't push him away or hold him hostage. His hands rested lightly on her waist for a second or two, then he broke the kiss and stepped back. It was then she wished she would have taken the advice of angel number 2, because it was going to be a very long time before anyone would get close enough to kiss her again.
You're welcome,
she said, then ducked her head, embarrassed. Avoiding his gaze, she turned and headed for the bedroom.
I'll be out in a minute.
Terrified of what sound might come out of her mouth next, she closed the door behind her, hurried over to the bed, and buried her face in a pillow. Her outburst was a cross between a scream and a laugh. It was just too insane to believe that a guy like him would look twice at her, let alone everything that had happened since she'd seen him at the coffee shop. Was there a catch? Was there something she didn't understand? Maybe she'd been so busy with her current responsibilities that some fairy godmother had been forced to bring Prince Charming to her.
Now, wouldn't that be nice?
But there was no room in her life for Prince Charming, at least not for a while, and it sounded like the guy wasn't going to be in Portland for long anyway. She sighed and rolled over onto her back, then got to her feet.
I guess he was just meant to be a one-morning stand.
After a quick check in the mirror to make sure she wasn't blushing anymore, she walked out into the living room with absolutely no idea what she would say next. But it didn't really matter. He was gone. Chapter 10. Zoc could have kicked himself all the way back to the coffee house, and mentally he tried. He was a fool. He'd allowed a lass to ruin everything. Why hadn't he made his excuses and gone his way as soon as he realized the old man was terminal? Why? Had the Battle of Culloden taught him nothing? There had been a mistake made, of course, and young Robbie had made it. The morning after the battle, he'd met Zoc rising from his grave and pronounced he was the 76th ghost to join what soon became Culloden's 79. What the others hadn't understood, that he was never meant to be counted in their number. It should have been Culloden's 78. The blame lay on his own shoulders, of course. He never corrected the boy even after he'd gotten his bearings and realized he was indeed a ghost. It didn't take long, however, for Zoc to understand that his reasons for holding tight to the in-between was not the same as his comrades'. The others felt cheated, he knew. They were angry to have been taken from the physical world before they had their fair share of it, and they longed to be revenged, or at least to have their tragedies heard, and rightly so. But for Zoc Macbeth, it was different. It wasn't the physical world he clung to, but the next life he fended off. On the far side of that shimmering veil that appeared from time to time to beckon him onward, stood a good-sized army, waiting for him. For 269 years, he'd ignored that beckoning. He'd been content to bide out eternity on the moors. After all, there was no substance to time as it passed. No regrets for time squandered, no desperate search for the meaning of his existence. And when he felt a twinge of loneliness, there were humans to examine, tellies to watch, or 78 other ghosties who gathered from time to time to play at war. Although he did share one thing in common with the others, his attachment to a certain wee lassie who turned out to be a witch. He'd watched her grow, watched her interact with number 79 and others, and all along he suspected she had not come in vain. On the night of the summer solstice, when she'd put forth her challenge, it had all become clear to him. She was to be their saviour, but she meant to doctor their souls first. The carrot she'd dangle before them, the chance to exact their revenge on Prince Charles Stuart himself, had been the perfect bait for the rest. Obviously, the offer hadn't interested Zoc, and he'd wondered, when Sonny got down to the last of them, how she might compel him to leave the moor. She'd been so confident. Had she known he was not like the rest? Of course she had. She told him, there at the end, that she knew the desires of his heart. Surprisingly, it hadn't been until Robbie was sent away that Zoc truly considered leaving Culloden. The lad couldn't have been harbouring revenge in his heart, for he'd been too young for that deep a passion. Nay, in a child that young, it had to have been a fear for the next life that had tethered him to the moor, and in Zoc's case it wasn't a fear, but a knowledge of what awaited him. This patch of common ground between him and Robbie is what made him ask himself if he might be ready to face that wee army after all. It had been a long while since the shimmering veil had come to beckon him, and the new door Sonny opened between one world and the next might well and truly close for good. Content as he was to stay at Culloden for eternity, there was enough curiosity left in him to give it a go. Surely what that army had in mind for him wouldn't last forever either. He was eager to face it and have done, if a certain witch would simply give him his task and remove him from Portland, Oregon, before he did any more damage to the living. The night before, he'd slipped back into his old ways, thinking he could make a difference for the lass, but he couldn't remove that terror from her eyes or her heart unless he lied about her grandfather's condition. And then, when the old man died anyway, her heartbreak would be trebled. Better to leave her and her grandfather be. Chapter 11. The scent of coffee grew stronger the closer he got to the building to which Saint-Cyr had delivered him, but with it came the memory of a certain kiss. Damn that smile. He lifted his forearm to his mouth, intending to wipe away the memory, but he couldn't make himself do it. Had he so many such memories that he could afford to wipe this one away? Nay. He dropped his arm and left the tingling alone. The line for coffee was out the door, much like the line for the voodoo doughnuts had been just before dawn. His mood turned sour when he stopped to wonder how many of the men in that line had come to patronize not the coffee house, but the sweet lass who worked there. Those fellows would be sorely disappointed. Feeling smug, he pardoned his way past the line and into the building. The coffee he'd just enjoyed had been far superior than could be anything on the menu, what with a kiss for a sweetener. But he wasn't there for coffee. He had come to clear his head and perform his task. Better to complete his quest and go before someone's heart was injured, not just the lass's, but his own. A fine kettle of fish. He bit his lip to curb his ire. It would be blasphemy to question what God had intended by putting him in Cupid's path only after he'd been dead for so long. Ungrateful of him to wonder why some charming woman hadn't stumbled across his path while he'd been a mortal young man. And it would be downright sinful of him to pursue sweet Catherine's affections while in his reanimated state. What good would it serve to woo her, only to leave her in another day's time? No, he had a duty to perform, he had a reward to collect, and he had an eternity to worry over the lass, or not. "Sonserie!" he bellowed to the ceiling, hoping she could hear him. It was no concern of his what the coffee patrons thought of his antics. He only needed a bit of direction so he would know just where he was meant to go. A gust of wind blew past the souls holding the door open in order to keep their place in line. It swirled around Zoc and nudged his duffel bag against his knees. In its wake, a single fuzzy blossom from a tree twirled around his head. He half expected it to land on the floor and turn into his beloved wee witch. "Sonny," he whispered. The blossom twirled again, then bobbed for the open doorway, unnoticed by those who simply watched to see what the foreigner would do next. And Zoc was a fool if he allowed it to leave without him. Outside, it took a moment to locate the fluff again. It danced around the top of a tree while it waited for him to catch up. He nodded to it, and thankfully, the teasing bit moved on. North again. Back the way he'd come. At least he hadn't been too far amiss when he followed the trio of thugs the night before. Had it been so recently? Less than a day since he'd met the lass over a gleaming silver counter. Only a day since she'd taken such consideration not to shout his family name and embarrass him. Half a day since he'd chatted with Alonzo and learned how near the man was to his last breath. And now that he knew Catherine better, he understood that her grandfather only fought death with such passion because he worried about leaving the lass. But what could Zoc do for the sorry pair? Nothing at all. He could neither heal the grandfather nor ease the burden on the granddaughter. So rather than flounder in futility, his precious last day would be better spent searching for a truly heroic act that would signal Sonny to collect him. The blasted bit of fuzz continued north. Folks on the street stopped and followed his gaze, but none seemed to see the will-o'-the-wisp but him. Was it only his imagination, then? He slowed and stopped, stretched his head from side to side, and looked about him. A flurry of bicycles passed, the riders all wearing numbers on their backs. No one in need of help, no one glancing his way. Finally, he looked up again. The fuzzy blossom hovered just overhead, barely out of his reach. It bobbed as if it would speak to him, then headed along the footpath again. It did not wait for him to catch up this time, nor did it dance about with the air stirring along the street. The little blossom seemed to mean business. So like Sonserie. Zoc passed intersection after intersection. His wee guide made nary a turn from the path he'd followed the night before. After a while, he knew with a certainty where it was taking him, so he wondered why Sonny bothered to continue. He nearly stepped out in front of a moving car, he was so intent on retracting his steps. The driver hit her brakes, but did not honk at him. She was simply content that he wasn't harmed and waved for him to cross the street with her blessing. He worried she was too shaken to continue on until she whistled at him. The blossom waited for him near the door of Catherine's apartment building just as he'd expected. When he was half a dozen steps away, the fuzz became a large, dark blur that spun and twisted into the figure of a man. His form was still undefined when he locked gazes with Zoc. "Macbeth." "Aye?" The man grinned. "You are in coffee, steeped in so far that you should wade no more. Returning were as tedious as go o'er." The twisted lines of Macbeth, the play. "You mock me." The man rolled his eyes. "You understand full well what I mean." "And who are ye, as summoned Sansaray?" "I am Wickham. Sonny, my niece, prepares for the long night ahead of her, so I've come in her stead." Zoc folded his arms defiantly. "She wouldn't have mocked me. She would have told me where my quest lay." The fellow pointed up, his finger angled slightly toward the front west corner of the building. "You are in coffee." "Cease your nonsense. What you meant to tell me is that I've gone too far to turn back now." "You kissed her." He lowered his head and narrowed his eyes, feeling much like an offended bull. "You watch me." "No, I see it on your mind at this very moment." Wickham stopped smiling. "Go to her. Help her. Prepare her for the long night ahead of her." For the long night ahead of her. From the mouth of a Moor. Alonso wouldn't last the night then. No matter what, the old man would find his immortal rest, and the lass would learn to deal with her loss. Zoc wouldn't be mortal long enough to see her through it. Funerals took days now. He shrugged. "I cannot help her, and false hope is the cruelest offering." He ignored the twist in his gut when he said it. "Who else but you?" Wickham's brow puckered dramatically, then cleared as if inspiration had struck him. "Never mind, Macbeth. I'm certain that Spencer chap can offer a shoulder." "Go on with ye." The man laughed. "I'll come for ye by morning." He turned his head, and the whole of him was suddenly not more than a swirling black fog that spun itself into nothing. Chapter 12. A stooped old woman hobbled toward the glass and pushed the door open an inch, then two. Zoc grabbed the handle and pulled the thing wide, then offered the woman a hand down the steps, all the while holding fast to the door. After a smile and a wave, the woman toddled down the sidewalk and he slipped inside the building. He found the stairs, unwilling to ride in the elevator again. The scenes from the movies he'd watched combined with his last experience after he left the lass ensured that he would never trust the box to spit him out again if he risked stepping inside. The doors hadn't opened when he'd needed them to and closed far too quickly. It lurched from floor to floor as if a demon possessed it and teased him. He was a nervous, quivering lad again before someone had stepped inside with him and got the box to open on the main floor. It had taken a full 5 minutes to calm his stomach. Zoc trudged up the stairs with heavy feet. Even the knowledge that he was returning to see sweet Catherine again wasn't enough to make him hurry. It was Culloden all over again, only this time he knew just how futile his efforts would be. Alonso was such a brave gentleman. If there was aught Zoc could do to ease his passing, he would do it. He reached the 4th floor, well out of breath. By the time he found Catherine's door again, he had regained his composure, but then nearly lost it again when she answered his knock. She'd been greeting. "Lass, what is it?" He pushed his way into the apartment and continued into the living room. Beneath the blankets at the end of the bed, Alonso's feet lay perfectly still. Zoc looked back at Catherine to silently ask if the old man yet lived. She frowned and shushed him.
He's still sleeping.
She waved him toward the kitchen, but then reconsidered and drew him down a hallway toward the rear. They passed her bedroom door, which she quickly pulled closed. Then she led him into the water closet and shut them both inside. He ignored the surroundings and took hold of her shoulders. "You've been weeping. Did you not see my note?"
Note?
He huffed out a breath. "Aye, I left a note on the table that I'd be back in the morning if I could." She shrugged.
It's not morning.
Her lower lip stuck out slightly, but it was sufficient to attract his attention. He tried to fix his gaze on her eyes instead. "Look, aye, the appointment I had for today has been postponed until tomorrow in the morning." It was mostly true. "So I came back to help watch over Alonso, if you'll accept my aid." She searched his eyes for a moment. Whatever she saw there brought her generous smile back. He had nearly forgotten what an impact it had, like a well-swung targe to the chest. He caught his breath and held it, savouring the moment. If only they weren't standing in a water closet, it might have been even more memorable. But he wouldn't have her looking back at a kiss from a Scotsman with a roll of toilet paper poking into his thigh. "I'll just wait in the hallway, shall I?" She didn't protest as he made his escape, and from the other side of the door he heard the delicate roar of the lass blowing her nose. When she emerged, that smile was still in place, and he ignored the twinge of guilt in his gut. It was little comfort that if he fell for the lass, or she for him, he could lay the blame at the feet of that Wickham fellow. They leaned back against opposite walls and tucked their hands behind their backs. A bare 2 feet separated them.
So?
She bit her bottom lip. Her right shoulder rose and fell. The sweatshirt she wore shrugged with her and promised to be soft to the touch. It was best his hands were trapped behind him. "So," he echoed, "tell me, do you always smile so? That is, when you're not weeping." She rolled her eyes.
I don't cry much, so I guess when it all builds up, it just comes out in a rush. Just emotional buildup in my body, that's all. I'm good now. I was just tired, I think.
He nodded, like he understood, when in truth he understood little. No matter why someone weeps, he was fair to certain all tears come from the heart. But he wasn't about to point out the simplicity of his theory. It was clear the lass was still not prepared to speak about her grandfather dying, even if her body was already mourning his loss. "And now you're not so tired?"
Nope, I'm fine.
She smiled a little harder, not quite as genuine as before. She rocked nervously against the wall at her back for a moment, while he took in the sight of her. Her jeans were frayed, whether by intent or not he could not say. Her sweatshirt showed its wear in the stretched-out holes created for her thumbs. Her hair was simply cut, long and sable. No fancy bleaching or colouring of her tresses, no elaborate designs on her fingernails, and he realised the lass would have little time to pamper herself, what with all her responsibilities, especially if she hardly had enough time to sleep. A generous lass who was staring at his chest. Her head gave a subtle shake and her eyes dropped to the floor. Then her attention caught on the duffel bag he'd dropped at the end of the hall.
Is your kilt in there?
She asked. "Aye,"
Ah.
she said, but he didn't miss a slight wrinkle of her nose. "You don't care for kilts today," he teased, letting her know he was fully aware of how much she'd appreciated his traditional garments the day before. She rolled her eyes.
Grandpa was teasing about that. I don't like men in kilts. Not at all.
She grimaced when she realised the insult.
And it's not the kilts, really. It's Scotland I don't like.
His surprise could not be hidden.
Look, Grandpa's a little obsessed about what little Scottish blood he has, and he started smoking a pipe because it was a Scottish thing to do.
And ye believe it is this pipe smoking that invited his lung cancer?
Yes, I'm sorry. I can't help it.
No worries, lass, I assure ye. Scotland and its inhabitants wouldn't begrudge your bias. Her smile was real again.
Thank you.
Immediately he remembered the way he'd thanked her for breakfast, just round the corner in the kitchen, and the memory drew his attention to her lips. She caught her breath, but didn't move. He wondered if it was part of his duty to distract the lass, to lure her thoughts to something other than her grandfather's condition. He pushed off the wall and took a step. Her attention fell back to his chest again, and he had to resist the urge to flex his muscles for her. When her gaze lifted again, it only made it so far as his lips, and it was the last bit of encouragement he needed. As soon as the two of you are done dancing in the hallway, I'd like to go down to the waterfront. Alonso stood at the end of the wall, pretending he wasn't hanging on to it for dear life. The moment was lost.
I'll get your chair.
Catherine chirped and ran into her bedroom. Jacques hurried around behind Alonso to give him a little support until his wheeled chariot arrived. The man didn't seem the least repentant for the interruption. Jacques murmured, "You have poor timing, Grandpa." The old man chuckled. "Do you think? Here I was thinking I was a little late to the party." Chapter 13.
He hasn't felt up to coming down here for a few weeks.
Catherine whispered, while her grandfather exchanged greetings with the old woman returning to the building as they were leaving it. The lass's tone implied she was heartened by the new development. She believed she had a reprieve, but Jacques knew better. The trip to the waterfront was a last hurrah. The morning of the battle, Jacques had realized that without some miracle it was likely he would not live through the day. So many details combined to doom the Highlanders that every man on that field should have recognized them. And while he stood there waiting for the Jacobite leaders to make their decisions, he thought of a dozen things he wished he could do with what time was left to him. He would have jumped in a loch and enjoyed the cold kiss of Scotland in springtime flowing over his body and prickling his limbs. He would have indulged in warm scones and sweet honey and paid no heed to the mess as the heat-thinned honey poured over his fingers. He would have hit his knees and bit a mouthful of grass just to make the taste of Scotland a sure and everlasting part of him. And he would have run to the lass he loved and made her part of him as well. But there had been no such lass. It had only been a dream for a future never reached, a dream that had been lodged in his head for centuries. And if the dream continued to haunt him in the afterlife, at least there would now be a face and a name to it. Catherine. In another life she would have been his, he was sure of it. He'd have kept at her until she relented and promised to share her sweetest smile only with him. He took a deep breath of city air and shook the pointless thoughts from his head. He had the remainder of the day to spend with her, and that was all. He would not squander it on futile wishes. He had a city to explore. First, they boarded a transit train named Max. There was a special area for wheelchairs, and with few others in the car with them, there were blessedly few witnesses to his indignity. He had seen all manner of travel on the telly, and he himself had travelled a quarter of the distance around the world in a heartbeat or two, but speeding so quickly from inside the train was like the disturbing episode in the elevator, only sideways. Though he expected the tracks to be clear, he couldn't keep from grasping onto the handrails and holding on for dear life. Surely they would crash into something unforeseen and suffer horribly for it. Catherine laughed at him. Even Alonso was able to raise a chuckle or two, So Zoc gave them both a merry wink and pretended his antics had been for their amusement. However, the wobble in his walk when they disembarked was real indeed. Their first stop was the Portland Saturday market. White tents were set up and filled with all manner of food and colourful trinkets. There was a bridge nearby he would have liked to go inspect more closely, but there was no time. Alonso pointed, and there they would go. A clever and gifted fellow by the name of Estefan stretched bread dough and fried it in a dangerous cauldron of hot oil. When it had transformed into a veritable pillow, toasted and brown, he presented it on a paper plate and plopped a helping of honey butter in the centre. Alonso declared he would have one, and Catherine was only too happy to oblige. She purchased one for Jacques and another for herself as well. "I suppose since you knew of my new affinity for voodoo doughnuts, it was an easy guess I would like this. What is it?"
A scone.
He choked on his next bite. "I'll tell you, lass, we've scones in Scotland, but they're a tenth of the size and 4 times the weight of these heavenly clouds." She grimaced. He realised his mistake. She was against all things Scottish. It was a wonder she allowed him near at all, doctor or no.
Where next?
Alonso pointed to the river. "Chess," he said. Catherine groaned.
That's pretty far, Grandpa.
The old man chuckled. "Don't worry, I'm up for it." He leaned back in his wheelchair, closed his eyes, and looked as if he was preparing to take a nap. "No worries," Jacques assured her. "I'll push him. Where do we go?" It was a long walk, and Catherine wished she would have refused to go. Despite her grandpa's energy, his colour still looked off, but Dr. Macbeth didn't seem to think it was anything to worry about, so she went along with the plan. If the patient had a serious coughing attack halfway between the 2 bridges, though, they'd be in trouble. Sometimes the oxygen wasn't enough to settle him down again, and if he passed out, she would prefer he was at home. He'd forbidden her to call an ambulance for him ever again, to just let him go. But the next time he passed out, she didn't know if she could do what she'd been told. By the time they got to the Salmon Street fountain, she was pooped, and she didn't think it had much to do with the exercise. If her grandpa suddenly decided he wanted to rent a bike and take off, she couldn't stop him. She was done. There were 3 tables set up under the trees. She had the Scot park her grandpa at one of them, while she went to the bike rental guy to get the chess pieces. The old gentlemen Grandpa usually played with weren't around, so she was going to have to play him herself. She hated chess. It seemed like a Scottish game. When she returned with the board and pieces, the blue t-shirt was sitting opposite the wheelchair. Her heart jumped with hope.
Do you play?
Zoc winked at her and waved her close. "I've told your grandfather I'm a bit green at it. He assures me he hasn't played in ages and he doesn't remember all the moves." He leaned closer to her and whispered even louder. "I don't believe him for a moment."
Smart man.
She grinned at both men, then pulled the thin blanket from the gym bag she always hung behind the wheelchair.
While you 2 duke it out, I'm going to shut my eyes.
She spread the blanket on the springy soft grass and stretched out on her stomach. Grandpa had a babysitter, and that babysitter was a doctor. What could a nap hurt? Chapter 14. Cat never dreamed. A lot of people say that, but what they really mean is that they don't remember their dreams. In Kat's case, though, she really didn't dream. When she wasn't jumping up to hit the alarm button in the morning, she would hold very still when she awoke and try to remember the last thought she'd had. But it was always the same, always the last thing she'd been thinking about the night before. Nothing ever happened in between. Not even when she started sleeping lighter, ready to jump out of bed if an alarm sounded next to her grandpa's bed, or if he rang the dinner bell she left on his tray for times when he needed help, or just needed company in the middle of the night. She just wasn't wired for dreams, or maybe she'd programmed her brain that way. Career later, fall in love later, dream big later. But this time, when she pressed her face against the soft cotton of the quilt and her conscious mind clicked off, she did dream. She was laying on a blanket in the middle of a wide field in Scotland. The grass was soft. It was tempting to just keep sleeping even though a heavy ground fog kept covering her up. She wasn't suffocating or anything, just getting lost beneath it. To her left, King Macbeth, or at least the actor who played him in a recent movie, sat in a wire chair and played chess with her grandfather, who was also sitting in a flimsy wire chair. Grandpa's colour looked better in spite of the creepy atmosphere. "Catherine has it wrong," the old man said. "I picked up my first cigarette when I was in the service. I just never told her that." "I see." It wasn't King Macbeth sitting across from him anymore. It was just Zoc. "So tell me about the battle." Her grandfather moved a chess piece and tapped the top of a square clock sitting next to the board. Zoc shook his head sadly. "It was doomed from the start, over in 40 minutes, but that was when the next horror began. Everyone I'd patched back together, every man who could be saved was cut down, run through. We'd already beat the Hanoverians in every battle, so when they finally won something, the Duke of Cumberland, either from battle fever or the evil in his soul, ordered that no quarter was to be given, no wounded were spared. I begged and pleaded for them. I tried to stand in the way and took sense into the English soldiers, but they soon tired of my harping and slayed me as well." "You were there?" Her grandpa's voice shook with awe, but he moved another piece, tapped on the clock and waited. "I was." Zoc said it with a straight face. "In 1746, the Battle of Culloden. You were there and you died." "I was, my friend, and I did." "Then why are you here?" Zoc made a chess move and tapped the clock. "What would you say, Alonso de Belco, if I told you I am the angel of death, here to take you home?" Kat tried to scream, tried to sit up so they could see her above the swirling mist and stop saying such things, but something held her down. Zoc heard a muffled squeak and looked over. Catherine was still asleep, but faced downward on the blanket and rocking from side to side. A nightmare, sure. He slipped off his chair and knelt beside her, then carefully rolled her onto her back. "Wake up, lass, wake up!" He shook her shoulder and patted her face. "Wake now, Catherine." Her eyes flew wide and she recoiled. Then she jumped to her feet.
You
were having a nightmare, lass. Forgive me for manhandling ye."
What does Culloden mean?
His stomach lurched. He thought the lass had slept too deeply to overhear any of his conversation with her grandfather. "Culloden?"
Yes. What is it?
"It's the name of a moor in Scotland. Why do you ask?" She stepped closer, laid her hands to either side of his head, and leaned over him.
Tell me you're not the angel of death.
The angel of death? What could have possibly made her say such a thing? He knew that nightmares could feel very real for a good while after he woke, but he usually knew them for dreams before he was ever out of bed. The lass hadn't had time to recover, that was all. He opened his mouth to speak, but was distracted by how fearfully she watched his lips, waiting for his answer. There was her terror. Could he lessen it by denying it, or by confronting it? He pressed a hand against one of hers, then turned his head and kissed her palm before answering. "What would you say, lass, if I told you I am?" Chapter 15. For a long, drawn-out moment, Kat stared into the blue eyes of death, and all she could think was,
Shouldn't they be black?
her hand tingled where he'd kissed her, and it returned her to reality. She'd been having a nightmare, that was all. And the Scot was just teasing her for asking him such a stupid question. But still, he shouldn't be saying that kind of thing with her grandpa sitting 5 feet away, and she'd warned him to keep his negative thoughts to himself. If she'd brought her taser along, she would have been tempted to use it on him again, and she told him. He bit his lip, but said nothing. His expression was unreadable when she shooed him off the blanket and started packing up. Thankfully, her grandpa didn't complain when she announced they were going home.
I need to start some soup,
she explained, while she rolled up the blanket and tucked it into the bag.
You always like my soup.
That was her way of telling him he was going to eat some, whether he wanted to or not. He'd only taken a bite of his scone, then played with it until he had a chance to slip it to the Scot, who sneaked it into the trash along with his own empty plate. If he was a doctor, he would know that it was important for the old man to keep his strength up. Did that mean he wasn't a doctor? She fought to keep her face from revealing her thoughts while she waited for him to return the chess game to the bike guy. But seriously, what kind of doctor jokes around about being the angel of death? Could his callousness have come from being on the battlefield? Even so, he should have been more considerate. Hadn't he seen firsthand how fragile Grandpa was? That a negative thought the size of a feather could knock him down? An unlucky flat tire on the wheelchair made it impossible for her to get her grandpa onto the train and into their apartment. Otherwise, she would have suggested to the Scot that their little outing was over and it was time for them to part ways. There was also the matter of the duffel bag he'd left behind. At the time, she'd been glad he would have to return with them. Now, she almost regretted it. But seriously, it was like fate made sure she had to keep him around. A little shiver ran up her spine.
Fate? Angel of death?
She couldn't believe she was even entertaining such silly thoughts. The guy wasn't the angel of death. Fate was something for the movies, and when she really thought about it, she figured she'd just overreacted to having her first dream or nightmare. Her real-world worries were simple. Life and death. She and her grandpa were alive. That's all that mattered. Now all she had to do was keep the seeds of negative Scottish ideas from planting themselves in Grandpa's brain. Lots of people had survived stage 4 cancers. Some had healed themselves naturally. It was possible. With all that chemo and radiation behind him, maybe her grandpa's body was ready to bounce back, ready to fight. No one could say for sure, least of all a doctor that didn't know anything about cancer. What did he treat on the battlefield anyway? Wounds, that's what. If he really was a doctor. They sat uncomfortably close on the train, but since her grandfather's wheels were locked in place and a good 5 feet away from them, she decided to take advantage. She leaned toward the Scot and whispered,
Which are you? A doctor? Or death, huh?
She gave him a dirty look.
It's not like you can be both, right?
His lips made a little grimace, and he said nothing. She could tell he regretted something, but what? That angel of death comment, or telling her he was a doctor? Her heart tripped. Was it the kiss he regretted? She turned her head away and watched her grandfather. He was dozing. A frown kept twisting his forehead, like he was having a nightmare.
Grandpa!
He started awake, looked over and forced a smile. The look he gave the Scot was something altogether different. It was like relief that the guy was still there. Well, that was just great. Now she couldn't just toss his bag into the hallway and close the door on him when he went out to fetch it. She leaned sideways, but didn't look directly at the man whose baby blue t-shirt no longer made her think about kissing him.
Look, I don't want you talking to him, do you hear? After we get to the apartment, I'd appreciate if you'd make some excuse and go. I don't want him thinking I've kicked out his new best friend, okay?
His large muscled arm stretched forward, and his warm hand rested on her knee. He gave her a gentle but firm squeeze. "Nay, lass." He kept his voice low too, like he didn't want the old man to hear them arguing. She would have to think fast if she was going to be able to ditch the guy and get her grandpa into the building by herself. Maybe she should walk to the back of the train, call the cops, and have them meet at the train stop. A glance out the window proved it was too late. The short ride was over. The enemy was stuck to her like glue. She'd have to wait for the right moment to make a move. If she dialed 911, they wouldn't have any idea where she was, and the guy would probably take her phone away before she'd a chance to speak. So much was promised in that gentle squeeze. The train stopped. She stood up and faced him.
Why are you doing this?
"I have come to help you, lass, and I will help you all I can, but I can do nothing if you sent me away. I'll be forced to tell Alonzo the truth." She touched her lips without thinking. The Scot noticed the movement and smiled. "Not that," he said. "I'll tell him who I really am, and you don't wish him to hear it."
Still going with the Angel of Death story? Are you kidding me?
She still didn't know who he was, but she knew what his crazy talk could do to someone fighting for his life, and he knew it too.
So, you're blackmailing me.
So it seems. At least he didn't sound cheerful about it, so maybe she could still convince him to go away and leave them alone. He had seemed so reasonable, so genuinely kind before. She couldn't imagine what had changed. Once again, she watched his arms strain to get the wheelchair moving, but he was careful not to jiggle the delicate passenger any more than he had to. They were still a block from home when her grandpa started whistling a tune that matched up perfectly with the rhythmic squeak of the traitorous wheel. A mild breeze ran its fingers through the trees overhead that lined both sides of the street, and she took a little snapshot in her head. As long as she could edit out the large man forcing himself into the picture. A moment to remember. A moment when her grandfather felt happy enough to whistle and had the strength to do it.
You see?
She wanted to say,
He's improving. You were wrong.
The whistling faltered, weakened, then stopped. The Scot picked up the tune and whistled loud and clear. She glanced at her grandpa, expecting him to look a little disappointed, but the man was beaming, as pleased as if he were able to whistle so well himself. A rare emotion hit her chest like a medicine ball, and she realized why, all day long, every positive thought she'd clung to had been chased out of town. She was jealous. Since the second he'd climbed through their window, all Zoc Macbeth had to do in order to win her grandpa's heart was to wear a kilt and roll his R's every now and then. The fact that she understood what she was feeling, and why she was feeling it, didn't stop her chest from burning, or her thoughts from turning mean.
I wouldn't think a Scot would know that song,
she snarled. The man stopped whistling. All soldiers ken the tune, lass. And to prove it, he started whistling it from the start, while his eyes laughed at her. Someday I'm gonna murder the burglar, sang her grandpa. Someday they're gonna find him dead, and then I'll get that other pup, the guy who wakes the burglar up. The last bit was sung by both men in unison, like a couple of drunks stumbling home from a long night, and it galled her like nothing before. The rest of the song was an irritating whistle, far too loud and cheerful. By the time they reached the front door, she had her fingers in her ears. With a warning glance, she told both men to pipe down before she used one hand to enter the code. The Scot tried to get her goat by humming then, but she just smiled that fake customer service smile she had honed for years, and she went on smiling when it was obvious he didn't care for it.
Poor baby.
On the elevator he turned to her, scowling. Do you always smile like that? She smiled harder.
Yes, I do. Being happy is a choice, right? So I choose happy.
You don't ever have sad days. That is, when it isn't just your body ridding itself of unwanted emotion. She stopped smiling, but only for a few seconds.
Sad is a choice too, right? Bad days, sad days. It's all a question of attitude. I get sad. I just choose not to stay that way.
He snorted. She snorted back, and the elevator fell silent. Chapter 16. Once they were all inside the apartment again, Alonso asked Jacques to park his wheeled chair near the bathroom.
Don't lock the door,
the lass warned him. The old man winced. Then promise you won't come looking for me if I happen to take my time.
I promise. I'm going to start the soup.
Jacques made a silent offer of aid, but Alonso shook his head and hobbled inside, alone. The evening was upon them. In Jacques' mind, the clock began ticking in earnest. Jacques! The man hollered from behind the door. He hurried to it, but his hands paused a few inches from the handle. My! He would not go inside, unbidden. Not after Alonso had warned the lass to leave him be. You'll stay, won't you? Came the worried voice. Aye, my friend, I'm going nowhere. He waited for a few seconds to see if the old man had more to say, but there was only silence. At the end of the hallway, he scooped up his duffel bag, took it into the living room and pushed it into a corner and out of the way. There was room to walk around the bed without tripping on it, and it couldn't be seen cluttering up the place. He sat on the couch and tested its cushions.
What are you doing?
Catherine stood near the end of the kitchen table with a large wooden spoon in her grasp. If you must know, I'm tasting the couch.
What for?
Your grandfather has asked me to stay.
Of course he has.
She turned and stomped back into the kitchen. He opened the curtains and cracked the windows a few inches to counter the humidity gathering on the glass. The soup smelled divine, and he resisted the temptation to tell her she cooked it in vain, that her grandfather would be wanting none of it. For anything that kept the lass busy for the rest of the night would be a blessing. 20 minutes passed, and Alonso had still not emerged. Hopefully, he was simply enjoying a bit of peace and quiet without Catherine hovering over him. It was high time for a truce. There was little daylight left, and he didn't wish to waste any of it staring out the windows or studying a bloody wall. If he was to gawk at anything, he preferred it to be the lass in the kitchen. He stepped up to the table, and she said nothing. The sudden stiff posture told him she was aware of every move he made, but her silent treatment continued. I would offer to take out your garbage, lass, but I fear you would not allow me back inside the apartment. Her lips started to curve, but she stopped them.
Good thinking.
He took a step to the side of the table, and something pressing demanded her attention at the opposite counter. Since she would need to return to the stove at some point, he moved closer to it. A timer rang, and she reluctantly stepped closer to him.
Excuse me.
She tried to go around him, but he blocked her path. Let's not fight, shall we? She rolled her eyes, fainted to her left, then scooted around to the right. When her hand stopped the ringing timer, she grinned like she'd won some race. He so loved that grin. She sobered quickly and opened the oven to lift out a pan of fresh rolls. He breathed in the smell of them, and her eyes narrowed.
Surely death doesn't need actual food.
Then she waved the pan about, knowing the scent swirled around the room when she did so.
Too bad.
He bit his bottom lip to keep it from sticking out like a petulant lad. He'd tasted fine things in the past day and a half. If he never tasted another, he would not feel cheated. He was almost sure of it. She pulled out 2 dishes and ladled 2 heaping scoops into both. "I think your grandfather would prefer only the broth, lass," he said, then realized he should have gone on, biting his lip.
He needs to eat something, and this is the most nutritious thing I can make for him.
The bowl grew too hot, and she quickly set it on the table. He held up his hands and backed away, hoping she'd forget he'd said anything.
Oh no.
She put her hands on her hips.
Let's hear it, Doctor. Whatever it is, I'll need to know it when you're gone.
The look in her eye reminded him of that moment when she'd deemed him worthy of tasing, and if not for that, he might have been able to control himself. But alas. He swiftly closed the distance between them and took hold of her arms, ensuring she could not elude him again. Then he whispered, "Your grandfather's body is done for, Catherine. Nothing more can go in, because nothing can come out. Do you ken? His digestive system has ceased functioning, amongst other things. He doesn't look well because he's a bit yellow. The toxins in his system have nowhere to go." Horror rose behind her eyes as understanding dawned, and it made him physically ill to know that he was the one to put it there. But at least he hadn't given her false hope. Never that. He wrapped his arms around her and held her tight, as much to comfort her as to hide from that look on her face. No hope, no way to run. The heartless bastards were advancing with their bayonets at the ready. "Sometimes," he whispered, "sadness will come, lass, whether we choose it or no." There was movement by the hallway, and they turned in unison to see the old man leaning with one hand against the wall. In his other hand, he held the yellow taser the lass had plugged in to gather a charge. His finger was on the trigger, and the dangerous end tipped carelessly to the side.
Grandpa, you need to put that down. It's charged.
Zoc could tell by the way her fists bit into his skin that her casual tone belied true alarm. So he gently pushed her aside and took a step toward Alonso. "Would you mind if I took a look? I've only seen the dangerous end of it myself, aye." The dangerous end suddenly came to attention and pointed at Zoc's chest. The man was much more alert than he seemed. "I want to know what you two have been fighting about all night," he said.
Grandpa, please, at least sit down. The soup is ready and the rolls are hot.
Alonso nodded, then moved to the end of the table and pulled out a chair. The thin, clear oxygen hose was missing from his face. His breaths were careful and constant, but shallow. In another few minutes, he might well lose consciousness. "I'm not hungry, sweetie," he said, "but you two go on." He panted a few times. "And while you eat, you can tell me what you've been fighting about." She put her hands on her hips again.
I'm not going to sit at the table with a loaded...
She gasped when the weapon turned and pointed at the bearer's chest.
Grandpa, please.
Zoc stayed calm. "You're scaring the lass." The man chuckled. "I'm a little scared too. I'm pretty sure this would finish me off. But what I want to know is how bad it would hurt." Zoc shook his head, but was careful not to make any threatening moves. "I'll tell you the truth of it, Alonso. Having been on the hot end of the stick, I don't know that I could find it in my heart to shoot it at the devil himself if he were standing right behind ye." He lowered his head and his voice. "I cannot imagine a meaner way to leave this world." The old man was surprised. "Really? Really? Bummer." He straightened his wrist and set the weapon on the table, but his finger was still on the trigger. "You were about to tell me about this fight." After a silent argument between himself and the lass, using nothing but eyes, Zoc finally spoke. Your granddaughter is having difficulty accepting that you're dying, sir. Alonso nodded. I know. Dying is the D word, and the D word is not allowed. But he's right, Catherine. I'm dying, and I'm fading fast. Zoc held out his hand and looked pointedly at the taser. The old man took his finger off the trigger and scooted it his way. The truth of the matter, he said, is that you will not last the night, and perhaps it's best that the pair of ye have the chance to say goodbye. Catherine's head shook rapidly.
No, you can't know that.
Alonso sighed. It feels true. The lass ran around to her grandfather's side and wrapped her arms around his neck and sobbed. Tears poured out of the old man's eyes as well, but he seemed relieved of the burden of putting on a strong show for the lass. After a while, Catherine kissed his balding pate and fled to the water closet, and, in her absence, the man sobbed as well. All Zoc could do was stand behind him and try to imbue him with a bit of his own strength through the hands he placed on the fellow's shoulders. It was not much better than he'd been able to do on the moor that day. A bit of consolation for some, a bit of hope for others, but in the end, luck proved bad for them all. Catherine rejoined them at the table, and she and her grandfather linked hands. She frowned up at Zoc suddenly.
His own doctors couldn't predict how long he had left. They said weeks, maybe months. You say hours?
He sighed and walked around to the far side of the table and sat. I've witnessed hundreds of final hours, lass. I ken the signs.
I don't think so. Try again.
She narrowed her eyes at him, assessing his honesty, recognizing that he was hiding something from them, the canny lass. You wish to ken the truth?
I do.
He looked then to Alonso. And you? I think the truth would be refreshing, son. Zoc nodded, then suggested Catherine bring the old man some oxygen so he didn't think he was hallucinating. Finally, when they were all settled in and the food cleared away, Zoc gave them the truth. He started with his name, where he'd been born, where he died, and the year. Catherine rolled her eyes but didn't interrupt. Alonso was mesmerized. Next he told them about rising from his grave and haunting the battlefield for nearly 3 centuries. By the time he got to Sansare's story, they were both entranced. Leery, but entranced. And I was sent to a coffee house in Portland, Oregon, to fulfill my quest. The rest of it you know.
I don't get it. What heroic deed are you supposed to do here?
He shrugged and shook his head. Maybe I fulfilled the bargain when I chased that trio of lads away. Perhaps when I was on hand to push a defective wheelchair halfway across the city. Maybe it was helping an old man say the D word again. Alonso winked at Catherine and gave her hand a hearty squeeze. That doesn't explain how you know that I won't last the night. Ah, what? Zoc shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, I wondered after breakfast if I might have been needed elsewhere, so I went back to the coffee shop. I demanded that Sonny show me where I was to go, and she led me back here. Only it wasn't Sonny. It was her uncle who came to verify my duty. If a Moor witch says something is to be, you can bet it is to be. Catherine was suddenly wide-eyed and quiet. What is it, lass? She shook her head.
Your appointment. It's been moved.
Till tomorrow, aye. The uncle said he would be collecting me in the morning. The regret in her eyes was gratifying, truly, but the pain in his chest was not. The soreness spread just beneath the spot where he'd been mortally wounded, and he recognized it. Though it was much stronger than it had been the last day, he knew it for what it was. Hopelessness. Not false hope, but no hope at all. And if he wasn't mistaken, the lass was feeling it too. but all they could ever be to each other now was a memory. Chapter 17. Grandpa insisted that since Zoc couldn't be around for his funeral, they would hold a wake then and there. He forbade any more tears and ordered the Scot to carry him to his bed, where he would play the part of the deceased. He admitted that was the only assignment he felt up to. As soon as Zoc lifted him out of the chair, Kat folded her arms on the table, pressed her face into them, and wept just as fast and hard as she could. Zoc cleared his throat and bellowed for her to turn on her computer and find some bagpipe music. "Bagpiping has been placed on the bucket list," he said. She was never going to survive this, and she wasn't sure yet if she was grateful or furious that she'd been told the date she was going to be orphaned. And when she did decide which way she felt, both the Scot and her grandpa would be gone, and there would be no one to thank or rail against. But at least she knew for sure she was going to feel cheated. The first bagpiping she found online was horrible, even Zoc agreed. But eventually they found a station that didn't sound like a drill going through her brain. The important thing was her grandpa loved it, and he tapped his toe in the air for a minute while Zoc danced her around the space next to his bed. When the mood threatened to falter, she produced a card table and a deck of cards. She taught Zoc how to play canasta, while Grandpa dozed on and off beside them. The Scot was atrocious at remembering the rules, and when he cheated at counting his points, they laughed so hard that tears leaked out of his eyes. He wiped his face and stared at his wet fingers. "I don't know as I've ever laughed so hard I cried before."
Really?
Though she couldn't name exactly when, she was sure she'd done it dozens of times. "Of course, there was little to laugh over on the Moor," he said, "and I canna remember laughing much in my life before Culloden. The first rising in 1715 had come before I was born. Afterward, when I was old enough to mill around with my father, the only talk among men was of another rising. Rebellion was served with every supper, and rebellion was hardly a cheerful topic. Oh, there was hope of someday getting a Stuart back on the throne, but the subject hardly lent itself to cheerful fantasies for young lads. Even younger, with a small wooden sword, I had been soberly fighting back the wraiths of English soldiers, a shout or two for imagined victories, and other than a bit of holiday cheer, there had been little to smile about. Survival, struggle, rebellion, hardly visions of sugar plums, aye." "A poem," her grandpa said. His voice was weak, but she pretended not to notice.
You have a poem in mind?
She took the improvised bucket list from him and tried to make out the writing, which she did.
Oh no, Grandpa, not this one.
"It's awake, isn't it?" She sighed and begrudgingly walked to the end of his bed, where his gnarly finger pointed. There was just no getting out of it.
Stop All the Clocks by W.H. Auden.
If she recited it quickly, maybe she could get through it without falling to pieces. It had been her grandma's favourite, and to Kat, it seemed like she'd known the words all her life. She took a deep breath and dug in.
Stop all the clocks. Cut off the telephone. Prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos, and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin. Let the mourners come.
That was it. That was all she could do. Tears filled her throat and made it impossible for another word to get out, so she covered her mouth and shook her head, hoping the old man would take pity on her. Zoc suddenly stood and faced the bed. "Let aeroplanes circle, moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, 'He is dead.' Put crepe bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. With tears in his eyes, Grandpa started clapping. His soft hands barely made a noise and fell back to his sides. Kat moved up next to him and started unwinding the tubes for the oxygen mask, but he waved for her to stop. "I'm fine. No need." He was breathless. He was lying, but she wasn't about to argue. It was late, but they left the curtains open so they could gaze at the stars. Zoc moved around the room and turned out the lamps so they could see them better. He left the small light on over the stove. She showed him how to stand close to the window and look off to the east to see if Mount Hood was visible. He pressed himself against the glass beside her and did as he was told. His hand rested on her shoulder and gave her a lingering squeeze. Tears rolled from her eyes across her smashed cheek and expanded against the fogged-up window. "Yes," Zoc said quietly. "I can see it fine." Together, they stayed that way for a long minute before she was finally able to get a grip and turn around. Grandpa hadn't noticed. He was asleep, and without the oxygen mask on, he snored a little. The most reassuring sound in the world. Chapter 18. Zoc led the lass to the couch, stretched out and bid her lie beside him. He was sure she would never consent to going to her own room. The bubbler on the oxygen tank created a bit of white noise to go along with the snoring, for which he was grateful. At least if the man stopped breathing, they wouldn't be left with deafening silence.
I should hold his hand.
"Nay, lass, he doesna want you to. He said so while we played cards, aye. He needs ye to let go." Her tears fell from her face and onto his arm. He never made a move to wipe them away. He felt privileged to have been available for the soaking, and to think he'd walked away from them that morning. He hoped he'd helped. He had tried to, but in the end, all he'd done was make her cry a day before she would have. The only one who seemed to be gaining anything from his attendance was him, for he was able to hold the lass in his arms for a wee while. So much for brave deeds. "Oh, you think so?" Wickham stood just inside the living room. Lit from behind by the stove-light, his clothing appeared to be black as the devil's. "Don't be so hard on yourself, young Macbeth. You've done a kind deed here, and kind is as good as brave, aye." Zoc held perfectly still, waiting to see if the man was visible to her as well. Anything was possible if the uncle could materialize in the lass's apartment without so much as a knock on the door.
Jacques, am I dreaming again?
He considered lying to her, but she'd realize the truth unless Sonny's uncle decided to disappear. The man snorted. "I'm going nowhere without ye, laddie." Zoc nudged Catherine's legs off the couch so he could sit upright. She rose with him and wrapped her arms around his middle, and thus entwined they stood.
Please don't take him. I need him a little longer.
Wickham shook his head. "Sorry, lass. We must stand by the rules." "And, Sansaray, may I speak to her?" Zoc crossed his fingers and hoped like mad that his wee witch had the power to grant him a little more time. After all, it wasn't yet morning. The devil flipped on the light and looked him straight in the eye. "It's morning in Scotland, aye, and besides, Sonny can change nothing. 2 days were paid for, and daily 2 days have been spent. Mortality must end again, Zuck Macbeth. Bid the lass goodbye. I am Zuck Macbeth. The declaration from Alonso was followed by a weak cough. Come and tell me goodbye, he said after he caught his breath. Give me a squeeze, Catherine, so I can go with this gentleman. He stepped around Zock's open duffel bag and stood half-bent at the end of the bed. The thin, long nightshirt he slept in was covered with a sash of plaid. The rest of the material was wrapped a number of times around his waist in the poorest attempt at kilting Zock had ever seen. And it touched him more than he could have imagined. The old man was willing to take his place, no doubt so his granddaughter wouldn't be left alone. But Alonso couldn't imagine what he was dealing with. Sonny was indeed a witch, and likely her uncle was a male version of the same, but their powers obviously were limited. His brave gesture couldn't work. Oh, thank you, Alonso. 'Tis a brave thing ye suggest. He has but hours to live, Wickham pointed out. A few hours given can hardly account for the full life ye might enjoy in exchange. Exchange? The word inspired an idea, and he sent Catherine away from him to face Wickham alone. I've done my duty. Ye have, but I have earned my reward. Ye have, but ye cannot. For my reward, I want you to heal this man. He pointed to Alonso. If Sonny can turn 79 ghosts back into mortals, she can heal one man of cancer, surely. Wickham took a menacing step forward. You cannot name your own reward. One was offered in the beginning, and ye can choose to take it or not. Zock closed the distance between them and tried to make the Dark One understand. Granting this man his health would go far to make up for all those others on the Moor to whom I gave false hope. It would make up for my cruelty, don't ye see? Wickham offered a gentle smile and nodded. Indeed, I do see. And I see this army you imagine waiting for ye in the next life. You do? Aye. His smile broadened. But Macbeth, they only wait to give you praise and thanks for giving them hope. False hope. Nay, the hope was real, and dashing that hope was done by others, aye. Better a man have a few moments of real hope and be disappointed than to wait in terror for what was to come. If you had to do it over again, would you walk away and let them die of their wounds before the bayonets reached them? Zock shook his head and admitted Wickham was right. And if he was right, that meant there was nothing left to dread. Wickham gave Alonso an almost kind nod. I cannot heal ye, old man. Alonso nodded, but he showed no disappointment. Zock took Catherine into his arms. Forgive me, lass, for loving and leaving ye, but try to dwell on the loving bit, aye. She nodded and forced a brave smile, every inch of her cheeks wet. Come, said Wickham, we need to make our accounting. Accounting to whom? Alonso pushed away from the bed, forced his shoulders back, and inflated his chest carefully. I say I'm Zock Macbeth. Now, let's blow this taco stand. Catherine moved in front of the old man and wrapped her arms around him.
You're so brave, Grandpa. You don't need to prove it, I know.
She straightened. But
I don't think it's going to work.
She turned back to Zock and worried her lip with her teeth, obviously torn between which man she should kiss goodbye. So he made it easier. He went to her and pulled her into his arms. Know this, Catherine, that ye have been loved well and true by your grandfather and myself, and though we love you still, another will come along and recognise your generous heart and love you for it. Dinna chase that one away with your mean taser, aye. She got up on her tiptoes and pulled his head down for a ferocious kiss. He wrapped his arms far around her and held tight, worried he stole her breath, but unable to let go just the same. "A fine kiss, lass. I shall remember it for eternity." It felt as if his heart was being ripped from his chest as he stepped away from her.
"And I'll come find you. I don't know how, but..."
She dissolved into tears again and lunged forward to sob against his chest. "Have you no shame?" Alonso barked at Wickham. "Look what she means to him. Take me, damn you." He took another step toward the dark man, but had to stop for a fit of coughing. Catherine turned toward her grandfather, but he held out his hand to stop her. "Done," Wickham said, then rolled his eyes and disappeared completely. No swirl of black smoke, no fading, just gone. And yet her grandfather still stood in the centre of the room, coughing. Zoc suddenly understood. It wasn't the old man's body Wickham would be taking, but his spirit. Zoc lunged just in time to catch the brave old man as he crumpled toward the floor. He wheezed and struggled for breath while Zoc carried him over to the bed, laid him down and reached for the oxygen mask. Catherine was right behind him, fumbling with the oximeter. She dropped it on the ground, then dropped it again while she tried to fit it onto the old man's finger. Zoc was grateful she was thus distracted when Alonso's spirit gave his body a final shake and freed itself. He turned to Catherine and shook his head. She grasped the old hand and began greeting in the usual fit of denial that came from losing someone beloved. He held her shoulders for a long moment, then moved over to the couch to give her time to realize her grandfather was truly gone, and that the shell that remained was no more than that. When it took her a bit longer than expected, he went back to her side and led her away, grateful when her weeping eventually subsided and she could breathe normally again. She shook her head against his chest.
"I can't believe he took your place. And they let him."
"I can hardly believe it myself. It means that this body of mine is permanent now."
"I'm so glad."
He had a thought that made him laugh. She insisted he explain why. "It just occurred to me that if Alonso took my place, and he might be meeting bonny Prince Charlie at this very moment, what would he do you suppose?"
"Oh, I'll tell you exactly what he'd do."
She grinned up at him.
"He wouldn't knock out his teeth or anything like that."
"No."
"No, but he'll definitely talk his ear off. Can you imagine? Without a cough to slow him down?"
Zoc grinned. "I hope there is no time limit to this meeting of theirs." Epilogue. The lad left his seat again and started up the auditorium steps. Zoc could not chase after him what with his daughter, Sonny, on his lap and the wee bairn in the crook of one arm, so he had to stop the boy with a stern whisper. "Alonso, where do you go?" The lad danced a bit and glanced at the zipper on his pants. "To wash the bark of a tree, da." Zoc shook his head. "Your mummy's about to come through the door, aye. Do you suppose you can hold it?" The lad rolled his eyes and nodded his round wee head. Just then, the professor stepped onto the stage and beamed. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Dr. Macbeth." Zoc caught his breath and fought back tears as sweet Catherine stepped onto the platform, her blue graduation gown draped with half a dozen tassels and ribbons. His chest burst with pride. He gathered Sonny close and jumped to his feet, but since his arms were occupied, he could but whoop and cheer, and he did so, with the same enthusiasm with which he'd once greeted bonny Prince Charlie himself. Unfortunately, his outburst left him with 2 greeting lasses. He glanced at his son, pleased to see the lad cheering his mother as well, but sadly, Alonso was jumping up and down in a wee puddle, self-made. Reacting to the moment as his wife had taught him, he allowed his head to fall back and his eyes to close in a prayer of thanks for all the positives in his life. puddle and all. This has been Macbeth, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 10, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Copyright 2015 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.